All right. Well, again, welcome everyone to our webinar. And today I have with me my teammates from the California School for the Blind Assessment Center. The California School for the Blind offers a multitude of services for the blind and visually impaired. And we serve children and young adults who are with the educational system. We provide intensive disability-specific educational services. And CSB, or California School for the Blind, serves as a statewide resource for our local education agencies and families. So our assessment center program is part of our outreach department, and we provide parent and staff consultations, student assessments, and professional developments like this. And we wanted to give out a shout out to Lodi Unified School District. Thank you so much for being the spark that lit this fire to create this webinar that has over 1,200 registrants. And this is a strong indication for the need for more conversation and collaboration around this topic. We are thrilled to see, how much interest is out there for supporting students with low incident disabilities like visual impairment. We also like to acknowledge Dr. Betty Henry, who was my predecessor serving at CSB for over a decade. Our team expanded and updated her original work for this presentation and the accompanying handout, which was emailed, and we'll also drop it in the chat as well in case you had any mishap with your email. And we pulled in recent research, expert guidance from giants in the field like Stephen Goodman, Marnie Lofton, Carol Ann Evans, Therese Pelleco, and Steve Wittgenstein, as well as Sharon Bradley Johnson. These are some of the giants in our field of visual impairment, and we also pulled in our team's collective experiences and knowledge. So I'm gonna go ahead and share a little bit about our team. So we're not the end-all be-all experts. We're a small but mighty team of professionals who love to continually learn and provide supports for students. I myself am a school psychologist. My name is May, and I'm a licensed educational psychologist and nationally certified school psychologist. I'm also an adjunct faculty member at California State University, East Bay, and I currently lead the California State Special Schools and Diagnostic Center School Psychology Task Force. It's a great collaborative effort, and they also help provide input for some of the materials in our handouts, so I'm so thankful to them as well. I also created Psych Circular, which is a website for sharing free educational psychology related information. While I'm teaching, it doesn't get updated as frequently, but over the summer, I definitely plan to update it a lot. And I also volunteer with Furry Friends Pet Assisted Therapy Services. So now I'm gonna hand it off to Shelby.
Thanks, May. So I'm Shelby, and I am a teacher of students with visual impairments and a certified orientation mobility specialist. I'm also a guide dog instructor, and I have experience working with adults and students in itinerant and residential settings, and recently returned to CSB after 2 years in Uruguay, where I was developing a guide dog instructor trainee program there. Now I will pass it off to Stephanie.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. I am also a teacher of the visually impaired and orientation and mobility specialist, and I am the coordinator of the CSB assessment program. So if you send emails, most likely I'll be the one to first send you back an email. I've been a TVI for over 20 years, and I was on the ABC Braille study. I've also authored the Unit 3 of the Mangled program for UEB. And so I've been in the field for a long time, and I've really enjoyed all aspects of it. So great to see you, and thanks for coming. And I'm going to turn this over to Rebecca.
Hi everyone, I am Rebecca. I am the speech and language pathologist on the CSB assessment team. I started my career in Boston, graduated from Emerson, and started off doing early intervention and working at a school for the deaf and hard of hearing, and recently came back to California to join this lovely team. And I think we are ready to get started.
Alrighty, and yes, I am so glad that we have a full team. Everyone on this team is so collaborative, and I really feel that it kind of exemplifies what we hope to strive for in terms of our assessment process of sharing our ideas and being open to different ideas and having dialogues about, even if we don't agree on everything, we still can learn from each other. And so when we're starting off with your first evaluation case with a student who has visual impairments, it might seem really daunting at times because it goes against some of the practices you learned as a graduate student in school psychology, in terms of, you're told to never break standardization, but here we are telling you break standardization. But remember, everything is hard before it gets easy, and with patience and practice, we can hone our skills and the novel becomes not a problem. And so there is so much more to visual impairments than we can fit into 3 hours. So the focus of this presentation is to learn about some basic concepts around visual impairments and provide a general overview of best practices in the context of school-based evaluations. Without some foundational knowledge of visual impairments, understanding of how to provide evaluations becomes limited. And we acknowledge that some of the ideas we'll discuss today may be best practices, but may not be very easy to implement in local school districts where a lot of the staff are itinerant staff and going between many, many schools. We are hoping to cover other topics such as VI Plus in more depth in the future, but right now we're just going to be mentioning some ideas today. And like Rebecca mentioned earlier, every so often we'll pause in the presentation to do interactive activities and address some questions in the chat. And I see many of you have already figured out and clicked to change your chat to panelists and attendees. So if you want everyone to see the messages you're putting in the chat, please change your to all panelists and attendees. And just to preface this presentation, this is a very California-centric point of view, and we recognize that practices may be different in other states or countries. We may agree or disagree with some of our ideas, but like I said earlier, we welcome a dialogue and communication with others in the field. Like Rebecca mentioned earlier, our emails are in the handout, and we would love to collaborate as it's possible within the confines of our job of serving California, of course. And when we discuss our differing views, again, like I mentioned earlier, we can, learn from each other and help the field progress together. And so our handout is going to be a live document, which means that we intend to add and edit and adjust the information as we continue to research and present on this topic. I know that Arizona State Schools for the Deaf and Blind are working on a guidance document right now, and other states most likely have some guidance documents too. So please feel free to share your resources with us, and we can link your resources in our document to share out with whoever has access to our document. And like you might have already seen from our email that came with registration, a good primer, if you're new to the world of VI or visual impairment, is More Than Meets the Eye. It's a video that was created by our previous assessment center team members to share information to those who are new to the students with visual impairments. All right, so first of all, we'll have a little poll, and we want to find out who is with us today. And I know there might be more who are viewing through hopefully YouTube or Facebook. So we'll only be able to capture who's here today within our Zoom webinar. If you could please respond to who are you, a TVI, O&M, FLP, Psych, grad student, administrator, or other awesome people. And where are you from? We use the US Census Bureau regions of West, Midwest, South, Northeast, and International. And thank you, everyone. I see that so many responses are flooding in quickly. And so far, it looks like majority of us are psychologists and teachers of students with visual impairments. And feel free to put in the chat if you haven't done so already, share out where you're zooming in from. We have people from Canada. Oh, and I love how someone defined who they are. Other awesome people. We have some parents with us. Feel free to drop in the chat too if you selected other awesome people. What is your role or title? Lots of Canadians with us. Thank you so much for joining us. All right, and it looks like our poll has slowed down a bit, so we'll go ahead and close it out. The majority of us are school psychologists or some type of psychologists, and next biggest group of folks with us here today are TBIs, and most of us are coming from the West. I feel like we have a strong representation of Californians here with us today, and we have about 76 people coming in internationally, so thank you for joining us. I think we have a lot of Canadians, but I did see in our registration some other countries or logins from other countries. So we're going to continue with our next part, and I'm going to hand it off to Shelby.
There we go. Thanks, May. So we're going to start off with Visual Impairments 101. This is going to cover introduction to visual impairments, vision characteristics, important definitions, VI special education eligibility criteria, impacts on learning and development, and the expanded core curriculum. We did request that you watch the More Than Meets the Eye video prior to this session, and this extensively covers the information. So we're going to try to just do a quick recap so that everybody has the foundation that they need to understand visual impairments prior to moving into student evaluation. Another poll. We're gonna wait. Hold on. There we go. Another poll. True or false? First, VI is a low incidence disability. Retinopathy of prematurity is the leading cause of visual impairments in children. And lastly, all students with VI have some functional vision. So let's see as the results come in. Got a lot of true for the first one, being a VI being a low incidence disability. Retinopathy of prematurity is the leading cause, about 60-40 split right now. And number 3, if all students with VI have some functional vision, they have about 77% say false as of now. We'll give it a little bit more time to see as the results come in. So everyone's pretty darn confident that VI is a low incidence disability. We're up at 92% say yes. All right. Still coming in. All right, so it looks like it's slowing down now if we want to go ahead and close that up. Thank you. So we had, for number 1, VI is a low incidence disability. We had 92% of participants say that this is true, and 8% say that this is false. For number 2, retinopathy of prematurity is the leading cause of visual impairments in children. We had 44% say that this is true, and 56% say that it's false. And for number 3, all students with VI have some functional vision. 23% say that it's true, and 77% say that it's false. So let's go ahead now and find out the answers. There we go. These are the facts. So the first one is true. VI is a low incidence disability. According to the US Center for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, nearly 3% of children under 18 are blind or visually impaired. In 2020, the American Printing House for the Blind, their annual report stated that there were 56,137 students in the US that were registered as blind and visually impaired, and 5,471 of those students are in California. At the end of 2018, the California Department of Education reported that almost 800,000 total students were enrolled in special education. And of that almost 800,000, 3,403 were identified with visual impairments. So that's just 0.4% of students served in special education in California. And this tiny percentage is consistent throughout the US. So yes, it is a low incidence disability. And even within special education, which is already a small percentage of the total student population, students with VI is a very small portion within that population. Yet these students have very specific needs. So if you're not a vision specialist or you're not working in blind rehabilitation, you likely won't work with students with VI often. So it's understandable that there may be questions about VI and how to best evaluate these students. Number 2 was false. Cortical visual impairment, or CVI, which is a brain-based visual impairment, is the leading cause of VI in children. And this has been true in developed countries for over 15 years and is now also the case in lower and middle income nations. A big factor in this is that as science and technologies advance, we're saving more medically fragile infants, and these infants can often have CVI. Stephanie is going to talk more about CVI a little bit later on, so stay tuned for that. And the last one was false. Most individuals with VI have some functional vision, but not all. You may think that if you see somebody using a long white cane that they're totally blind, but in fact, they often have some amount of usable vision. And this can help them both in the classroom and in the community. And even when a student has just a little bit of vision, they can often use it quite well to access visual information in the environment. One thing to note is that there's a lot of diversity within the population of individuals with vision impairment. So each student is just that, an individual learner. There's a bit of a delay when I switch slides. Vision characteristics. We're going to talk about visual acuity, visual field, contrast sensitivity, color perception, and stereopsis. So here we're talking about that large portion of individuals with vision impairment who have some functional or some usable vision. Each person's vision is unique. So you want to be careful about making generalizations about low vision, but you can make some generalizations. So we're going to give some examples about vision characteristics, but remember that a student might have a combination of these and their vision might not be exactly like the examples that we're showing you. The simulation can help us begin to understand how a student sees. We'll show you some photos and give you some vision and simulation activities in the handout, but it's important to recognize that this is just a snapshot in time for us, and it's a very different experience for a student who is living with this vision loss all the time. So we have our past memories that we can draw on. There we go. Visual acuity. So this is the clarity or sharpness of a person's vision. It's how well they see details. Let's talk about 20/20 acuity. This is the measurement of typical visual acuity. So if you have 20/20 vision, you can see clearly at 20 feet what should normally be seen at that distance. Visual impairment is measured against 20/20 vision, 20/20 acuity. So let's compare that with someone who has 20/200 vision. So a person with 20/20 or typical vision can see a target from 200 feet that a person with 20/200 vision can only see from 20 feet. So this means that a person with 20/200 vision must be 10 times closer to an object than a person with 20/20 vision. And since I know we have some international attendees here, in the slide I have 20 over measurements and then also 6 over measurements. And that 6 over in the photo of the mouse on the right, and it's measured in meters, not feet. So, but the concept is the same. So 6/18, the person needs to be 3 times closer to see what a person with typical vision can see. That person needs to be 6 meters away to see what a person with typical vision can see from 18 meters away. Visual field. So this is the entire area that can be seen when the eyes are focused on a single point, and it's often looking forward. So typical visual fields extend about 180 degrees wide and 130 degrees top to bottom, and it's a circle. And this is with both eyes viewing. If you go to the optometrist, they have a test where you kind of stick your eyes in between in the machine or stick your head in, and then they give you a button to click. And you're clicking when you see a little dot appear. This is what they're testing, and they're testing the vision throughout your field. A person can have a visual field loss or a restricted visual field in a variety of ways. One of that is on the side, so they can lose peripheral vision. And this is something to keep in mind when, sometimes we think, oh, a student with low vision, let's just make it bigger. But if something is magnified, then this person has a smaller area to look at, so they're actually seeing less of the information at a time. A student could also have a central visual field loss. So that would be like if you put your fist up in front of your eye. And this is going to make it very difficult for reading. Sometimes students can also have a hole or different holes within their visual field as well. Or they could have a combination or a portion of one of these. One thing I like to point out is that in simulators, like in some of the photos that I have of the different visual field examples, we see black, but a student with visual impairment doesn't see black. So it just doesn't exist for them. Contrast sensitivity. This is the ability to distinguish shades of a color from its foreground to its background. Clinically, this is measured with shades of gray getting lighter and lighter against a white background, but it's found all throughout our environment. Poor contrast sensitivity makes it hard to tell changes in elevation. So if there's stairs or curbs. In the photos that I have on the left, you're looking down on a flight of descending stairs. And on one side of it, it's good contrast sensitivity. And then on the other side, it's poor contrast. And in that one, it's hard to tell. Are they stairs? Is it a slide? Is it a ramp? You don't know. And then in the second photo in the middle, there's a bright yellow. It's bright yellow and it has high contrast, and that really draws your attention to it. In that photo, there's tactile domes at the end of a sidewalk, and that highlights that you're coming up to the edge of the curb. There's also at the top, there's some brown and dark gray grates in the street, but these have low contrast and it's kind of hard to see them. And it's kind of hard to tell too, like, is this a ramp or is it a step down curb? The photo on the right, it's using the same image that I used for the acuity with international acuity. It's a mouse, but this time the image is fading. So the clarity is still there. It's not getting blurry, but the amount of information that you can see is fading. For a student who has poor contrast sensitivity, lighting is very important for them so they can optimize the use of their vision. It may depend where you put the light. They may need more or less lighting depending on how sensitive they are. Color perception. This is the ability to accurately perceive color. In the photo there's 3 square plates in the upper right-hand corner. One has a patch of blue and one has a patch of green. So if you have vision, take a minute and see if you can tell which has the blue and which has the green. If you can't, and the image is big enough and bright enough on your screen, you might have an issue with color vision. The most common type of color deficit is when it's hard to tell the difference between red and green. So I have an example of fruit on the shelf at a grocery store, and on the left side, there's green and yellow and red and some orange in there. And on the right side, it's that same photo, but through the lens of someone with a color deficit. And so all of the colors are kind of a muted gray, green, brown, and there's very little variation between them. And this actually goes to show how we use color to identify or describe things in everyday language. Less common types of color deficit is if people confuse blue and green or yellow and red. And the most rare is monochromacy, which is complete color blindness, where you can't see any color at all. Depth perception. So here I'm going to talk about depth perception and stereopsis. So depth perception is the ability to perceive relative distance of objects. So how can you tell if something is closer or further away? How can you tell that one step is further than the next if you're going upstairs? In order to do this, you need to have binocular vision. So you need to have vision in both of your eyes and good contrast sensitivity. Students with monocular vision, so if they only have vision in one of their eyes, are not going to have depth perception. And you may see this, that they have trouble if they overreach or underreach for objects that they're trying to pick up. Stereopsis, this is the ability to use both eyes together. So this helps with depth perception. If you're testing the stereo vision, you're looking at how the student's brain uses the images from the two eyes. So almost all low vision students are biocular. This means that they have two eyes with vision, but they don't work together to create stereo vision. The eyes are actually sending two separate images to the brain. And this provides some depth perception, but like I mentioned, not stereo vision. So what's this do? This is gonna cause reduced depth perception for very fine depth tasks, such as threading a needle or pouring clear water into a clear glass. Additional aspects of VI to consider. The cause of someone's visual impairment can be important to understanding their vision and the use of their vision. A student can have more than one. It can be ocular and or cortically based. So if it's ocularly based, that means it's coming from the eye. There's a physical impairment to the eye itself. If it's cortically based, then it means it's brain or neurologically based. And this means that it impacts the brain's ability to accurately interpret what the eye is seeing. So the eye itself is okay, but there's something faulty with how the information is processed in the brain. Ocular and cortical visual impairments have different associated visual and behavioral characteristics, and appropriate intervention strategies will vary depending on the cause of visual impairment, if it's ocular or cortical. The age of onset is also important. A student who had sight in their early years of life and lost vision will have visual memories about the world that can promote basic cognitive and developmental concepts. They may think about the world in visual terms, and this is called adventitious vision loss. So it's vision loss occurring after birth. If they had some prior functional vision, they'll have better understanding of visual concepts such as space, shadow, distances. And the other part of age of onset is congenital blindness or congenital vision impairment. And this is when it's present at birth. So a student who is born blind. And this student will have a very different understanding of the world than a sighted student. They're going to lack the visual references for concept development. And we'll go into concept development into more detail a little bit later on. The presence of other disabilities, or what we call VI+, and I know this can be huge. Please, please always remember that students with VI can have the same additional disabilities as any other student. Far too often I've heard of students who are struggling, but they're not being assessed because it's assumed that their difficulties are due to their visual impairment. And yes, we're going to talk about many impacts of visual impairment can cause, but remember that the incidence of other disabilities within the VI population is the same as any other population. So it may be challenging to tease out the additional disabilities, but don't ignore the clues. If you have a student who's been learning Braille, for example, for 4 years and has only mastered 12 letters, that's a really big red flag. Some examples of common additional disabilities include autism, learning disabilities, motor impairments, intellectual disability, speech and language disorder, or deafblindness. And Appendix C of your handout has resources for each of these disabilities combined with VI areas. And lastly, prognosis. So someone's vision could be stable, or it could be progressive or degenerate. Only students with CVI with these students can we anticipate that a student's vision will improve with appropriate adaptations and interventions. With some ocular conditions, they're first going to show symptoms of vision impairment in adolescence and can eventually lead to total blindness. Some other ocular conditions do not cause blindness. A person's vision can also be consistent, or it can fluctuate, and it can fluctuate hour to hour or day to day. In some conditions, a student might be able to see on a cloudy day, for example, but not on a sunny day because it's too bright. Or with other ocular conditions, the student might see well during the day, but struggle in low light or nighttime situations and need to use a cane only in those low lighting situations. It's really helpful to work with your students on being able to express this on how well they can use their vision and in what situations. All All right, I'm going to pass it off to Stephanie.
Everybody, okay, so we have another set of true false questions that we're going to launch here. And the first one is, all students who have VI services on their IEP are legally blind. The second question is, a person who is legally blind has no light perception, for example, the absence of any vision or total blindness. So we'll give that a second. We have, let's see, people are putting in their answers. Looks like the majority are saying number one is false. 93% to 7%, and number two, the majority of people are saying again false. So give it another second just to put in your thoughts. All right, looks like we're pretty much in general agreement here. Yep, okay. So for the first one, the consensus was false. All students who have VI services on their IEP are legally blind. That is correct. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And number two, a person who is legally blind has no light perception. Again, false. So you were all listening very carefully to Shelby's explanations. All right, so I'm going to talk about what is meant by functionally blind. Oh, can we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. Functionally blind is often used interchangeably with totally blind. Vision for these students may range from some light perception to completely blind. However, none of these students have vision that would help them function at school, home, or in their community. Functionally blind individuals must rely on their other senses as a major channel for learning. We're also going to talk about what is meant by low vision. So individuals with low vision have a permanent and significant loss of vision that cannot be corrected. It involves loss of acuity and or visual field. However, it is better defined in terms of function rather than through numbers. It's important to note that individuals with low vision may use their remaining vision as a primary or secondary learning channel. Individuals with low vision might use a variety of tools, which could range from Braille, white cane use, magnification, large print, or other adaptive technologies. We're going to go on to the next slide. There we go. So Shelby mentioned earlier a little bit about cortical visual impairment, or CVI. So CVI is a vision impairment caused by neurological damage or trauma. It is, as Shelby mentioned, it is now the leading cause of pediatric blindness in developed countries. You may notice that I'm using the term cortical visual impairment versus cerebral. So over the years, there have been many articles and heated discussions as to the most appropriate term. And I'll say that some of those discussions are still going on. Cerebral vision impairment is more of an umbrella term that can encompass many etiologies, including cortical visual impairment and visual processing disorders. This difference becomes very important in understanding why TVIs do not provide intervention for students with visual perceptual difficulties or provide vision therapy. CVI is often difficult to diagnose, but it should be suspected if, number one, there is an eye exam that cannot explain the child's functional use of vision. Number two, if there is a history of neurological problems or brain damage. And number three, if there is a presence of visual and behavioral characteristics associated with CVI. Dr. James Jan and his colleagues first discovered the 10 behavioral characteristics of children with CVI. And since then, Dr. Christine Roman-Lancy has developed the CVI range that is commonly used to assess students who have or are suspected to have CVI. And the 10 visual characteristics are described in Appendix B of your handout, along with several resources for more information. because CVI on its own could be a whole long webinar. But I am going to show you a couple of simulations to talk a little bit more about CVI. So I'm showing you a picture that is in black and white, and I'd be surprised if very many people can actually make out what the picture is of. So this is an example of how a child with CVI might see a picture. If we were in a room together, I'd ask you to raise your hand if you can tell what this is. My guess is that most of you cannot. There are several of the CVI characteristics that are causing this difficulty. And I see a couple people think they know what it is, including color, visual novelty, and visual complexity. There is no color to this picture to help highlight the important pieces of the picture. In terms of visual novelty, it will depend on your familiarity with the object. And in terms of visual complexity, are there elements of this picture that are making it difficult for us to focus on what the picture actually is? So a couple of folks are putting in their perceptions. Someone thinks it's a woman. Someone said it's a hockey helmet and a mask. Someone else thinks maybe a bird and a nest. Thank you for putting those in. A vulture, a profile of a woman. I like this one. A dirty room. Someone says a cow. I think I saw a horse earlier. So let's go on to the next slide. This will give many of you a clue of what it is, or a leaf. So this is now the same picture, but it represents how a person with typical vision sees the picture. Can you tell what it is? Think about, did it take your brain some time to kind of see the picture? And if you felt that little lag, that's what we refer to as visual latency. So most people are saying that they can now, oh, someone says a girl feeding a cow. I'm not even sure I see the girl, but it might be there. And someone says they don't recognize either picture. So perfect. I'm going to go on to the next picture. And this time we have a red outline of the cow. So now we've added the color to help you focus on the important features, or sometimes known as the salient features. So this is just a little bit of a simulation of CVI and how the interventions for CVI become really important. So moving forward with our definitions. The next definition that is important to understand is legal blindness. Legal blindness is defined as visual acuity of 2200 or less in the better eye with best correction, or a field of vision that is no greater than 20 degrees. So this is a legal term. It's not the criteria used for determining whether a student qualifies for services from a TVI. And so this leads to that false, for my original question was, a person who is legally blind has no light perception. So you can see here with these numbers that you can actually have a fair amount of vision and still be considered legally blind. In fact, there are folks out there who are legally blind that are still able to drive with corrected lenses, with not corrected lenses, but with monoculars and special driving glasses. There's a quote on the screen that comes from the California Code of Regulations, Title V, and this states visual impairment, including blindness, means an impairment in vision that, even with correction, adversely affects a child's educational performance. The term includes both partial sight and blindness. So as you can see, this definition does not include any numbers. Through a functional vision assessment, the teacher of the visually impaired will determine whether a student's vision adversely affects a child's educational performance. Students with cerebral or cortical visual impairment may qualify for special education services. It's also important that visual impairment does not include visual perceptual or visual motor dysfunction resulting solely from a learning disability. And this is where things tend to get confusing, especially with our students who have cerebral visual impairment that does not involve the cortical. So this is another reason why it's so important to collaborate with your teacher of the visually impaired to determine the cause of the visual impairment. And lastly, a medical diagnosis is helpful and preferred, but it's actually not legally required in order to complete the functional vision assessment. And I believe our handout has more information on that, because we get a lot of questions from teams as to whether or not a medical diagnosis is required. And again, it's definitely preferred, because knowing the background can help us know what is going on with the visual impairment. So we have a question break, and I'm guessing we've got questions in the chat. May's going to help us go through those questions. And if you have any other questions, feel free to put them in the chat. And if we don't get to them all now, we will definitely send responses at the end.
Thank you, Stephanie. And I wanted to share that what we are presenting, again, I want to reemphasize that this is a very California-centric presentation. In other states, your regulations may be different, and they may require that the visual ophthalmology or optometrist report. But in California is highly recommended, but it's not required. And so I saw a question in the chat about SLD, specific learning disability, and I saw some members of our audience, including I believe Carol Evans. She's one of the greats in our field. So thankful that you're here joining us today, or you responded to, but I also want to share some additional information. So having a visual impairment does not preclude eligibility under specific learning disability if the educational code criteria are met. So specific learning disabilities do not include learning problems that are primarily the result of visual, hearing, or motor disabilities, or intellectual disability, or of emotional disturbance, or of the environment, culture, or economic disadvantage. So you could have a visual impairment, in addition have some specific learning challenges where, you know, not everyone might have show benefit from learning Braille or with cane instruction for mobility. The effects of a learning disorder can show up in Braille literacy, and it's important to tease out if the student has a true disability or is just having difficulty with the Braille code. And students with visual impairments, they may have additional challenges with learning that, you know, are being caused. A lot of times it might be easy to assume like, oh, it might be caused by their visual impairment. But like someone mentioned in the chat, once you rule out with appropriate supports that it is not an artifact of not having access to the learning material, then we should address this challenge. And in California, we don't really have, in general, a strong RTI system, response to intervention, but in some other states like Minnesota, they do have a great response to intervention. So that's another way to look at specific learning disability. There are 3 paths to specific learning disability. Usually a lot of people use the traditional path of discrepancy model, and then there's the other path, RTI, and the third path is the pattern of strengths and weaknesses. Personally, I would prefer the patterns of strengths and weaknesses model when we're looking at students with visual impairments, because, and we will mention this later on, we do not recommend that full scale IQ scores be calculated for students with visual impairments or other indexes that might be impacted by vision. So the patterns of strengths and weaknesses method might be the most helpful for answering this kind of question, and consider if the student was provided appropriate educational experiences, like did they have consistent attendance, or did they have multiple absences due to medical procedures or illnesses, and were the TVI's recommendations from the FBA and LMA actually implemented consistently and with fidelity. Some students might have different accommodations or assistive technology listed on their IEPs or 504 plans, but are they actually using them? And also, does the historic data from records review indicate consistent challenges with specific academic areas that do not appear to be related to changes in learning medium, like from print to Braille, or significant changes in vision?
May, I'm going to jump in and answer a couple of the questions that I saw in the chat that are about just what we spoke about. So the first question is, do California TVIs service CVI students? And the answer is yes. So if a student has a cortical visual impairment, that is something that TVIs do see those students, and I highly recommend take a look at our handout. We have resources for you. I know CBI is tough, it's confusing, and even our team is currently taking the CBI webinar from, CBI class from Perkins eLearning, being taught by Dr. Christine Roman-Lancy. If any of you have an opportunity to do that, or any of the other webinar offerings that have been out there during this pandemic, it's a really great way to boost your knowledge about CBI. Another question we have was, how do we ensure students have a visual impairment and don't just need glasses? Some students don't go to the eye doctor first. That is a really good question, and that's why why we want that medical diagnosis first, either from an optometrist or an ophthalmologist. Like I said before, districts cannot require it, but in such a case, if some districts do require it, and if the family is unable to go, then the district will send them and pick up the bill for that. If you are in California, actually, I take that back. I was going to mention our low vision clinic, but that actually is for students who are already been diagnosed with a visual impairment. So it is a tricky one, and if you suspect that they do need glasses, then that would be a case that you would need to get them to an eye doctor. One other question I was going to answer was, could you explain why a visually impaired teacher needs a current medical report? So that does piggyback on the one that I just answered. So it helps determine that indeed it is a visual impairment that cannot be corrected. And we also want to know what the current status is. If your student is totally blind, then oftentimes students don't get to the eye doctor. However, we do recommend that students do see an eye doctor every 3 years to check the health of the eye. So like any other medical condition, it's a good idea to be checked out, and it's pretty much on a case-by-case basis. And I think I had one more question I wanted to go over was, let's see, the question is, legally blind is 2200 or worse in the better eye with correction. But does it matter at what distance the 2200 is measured, near or far? What if the person has much better vision at distance versus near? That's a very, very good question. So typically, that 2200 is measured with a specified distance. It's measured at that 20 feet. So when you have an eye exam, we're looking at that distance vision. However, an eye doctor will often also look at your near vision. So 2200 is based on that 20 feet. If you have a student with a visual impairment, I highly recommend they have a low vision exam. And here in California, California School for the Blind does offer low vision exams. And they're typically for students who can get to our school because it is a in-person exam, and that helps really refine what their remaining vision is. And we look at their distance vision and their near vision and fields, and we can really, they're done by low vision specialists, so doctors that have an advanced sort of degree in low vision. So I'll see if any other colleagues want to jump in on any other questions, or we will move on.
And I just wanted to follow up, Stephanie. Thank you for answering those questions. I did see a related additional question in the chat relating to specific learning disability and RTI. So in California, and you know, I only have my limited experience of California in the Bay Area, but when I talk to my colleagues in the field and experts like Dr. James Hiramoto, who is the CAS assessment chair, and you know, he has many other positions, accolades, but he is a giant in terms of school psychology assessment, and Carl Corbin Esquire, who has training as a school psychologist and serves as general counsel for one of the law firms representing many school districts. And many of you might have seen him at the NAS Convention Center. I love hearing Carl and James talk. But anyways, both of them both see that in California, the districts that they have had experience with, which is much wider than my experience, most districts do not implement RTI with fidelity. We might like RTI as a concept, and do our best to try to start implementing it, but not a lot of districts in California actually have a super robust RTI system. Like, how often are you analyzing the data and moving students to different groups? And there's actually a research document, I believe it's from 2015, looking at RTI and the challenges with it. And so discrepancy model, our field has not liked the discrepancy model for the past like half century or so. And also PSW also has conflicting research because there's different ways of doing patterns and strength of weaknesses. So of the three, the most legally defensible is the discrepancy model, since there's much more case law about it. However, that being said, if you're in an area where they do have a very robust RTI model that is used systematically and consistently throughout your district, then you might be able to do that RTI route. However, for our students, typically, and I'll go into this more about what tests and what methods I like to use for assessments, but I like to use a cross battery type of assessment. And using that model, I like to analyze my data using patterns of strengths and weaknesses. Of course, we have those three different options. And again, this is my point of view. Others' point of view might differ based on the situations of their local educational agencies. And we're going to go ahead and move on. Yeah,
we're going to run out of time.
Great. Thank you, May. So now we're going to move on to the impacts of learning and development. So students with vision impairment need explicit instruction in all areas of learning, as they can't access the environment as can their typically developing peers. So they need to be given as many experiential learning opportunities as possible, learning by doing. As educators, the more meaningful opportunities for learning that we provide for a student, the more we foster success. But the question is, how can we be sure that our instruction is meaningful? And we're going to take a look at some key impacts on learning and development for students with visual impairment. And our team has sectioned out learning and development areas, but it's important to note that there is a lot of overlap among them. So if you think of language, concepts, social skills, incidental learning, they're all really intertwined within the learners that we work with. I apologize for the delay on switching slides. Incidental learning. This is learning through casual observation. So kids with vision impairments miss so many of these opportunities. Kids with vision take in information and they learn from things that happen at any distance, versus our students really need that hands-on instruction. And this can take more time and it can take more effort for educators, but it gives our students the opportunity to make meaningful connections and to generalize their learning. An example would be a student or a kid sitting at home at the breakfast table, and a kid with vision who's just reading the cereal box as they're having some cereal for breakfast. And this is going to provide all kinds of literacy opportunities for them. And this is something that our students would miss out on. And some other examples are sharing, making eye contact, or gestures, even something as simple as shaking your head up and down to say yes, or shaking your head left to right to say no, or shrugging your shoulders, like, I don't know. All of that is communication that our students are going to miss out on. Concept development. As I mentioned before, students who are adventitiously blind or lost their vision later in life will have some visual memories, and these are really helpful for understanding concepts. Understanding of concepts may be limited or fragmented, though, even if the student has access to tactile experiences. Students may also focus on isolated parts of a whole, and their knowledge can be like Swiss cheese. So on this slide, there's a photo, and we can tell from afar that it's a giant elephant, and there's people at different parts of the elephant, and they are using their prior learning and prior experiences to determine what they believe that they're examining that's right in front of them. So the person at the tail thinks it's a rope, or the person at the trunk thinks it's a snake. And it's not until you can really step back and see the whole picture that you can tell that it's an elephant. Another example is the concept of a car. So I worked with a young blind student who always sat in the same seat of a car. And to him, that was the car. So he didn't know how big the car was. He didn't know how many wheels it had, or that there were pedals, or that was a steering wheel that could control where it goes. And they just thought it was the coolest thing. And we went to the gas station and I let them help me fill up the tank. And so these are all just things that we might take for granted day to day, but for our students are opportunities that they're missing out on. Another example is colors. Even a student who's congenitally blind can learn color associations, things like the grass is green and the sky is blue. And this helps participate in conversations and understand stories. So I like to think of the example of going to the grocery store, and if you're asking for assistance for shopping and they tell you the bananas are green, you know they're not ripe. Or the banana's yellow, you know it's time to eat it. Or if it's brown or spotted, then it's overripe and not good anymore. Another example would be object permanence and constancy. So if a baby's playing with a toy and the toy drops and it's just out of reach, for one of our students, they're not going to be able to know that the toy is still there. And then this can result in little motivation for them to explore the environment. So they really need to be encouraged to explore. Another important concept with this is that students who are blind often start their educational path through rote memory alone, and we really want to encourage meaningful concept connections over rote memory. Motor skills. There's a misconception that students with visual impairments can't move like their peers. But in reality, their ability to move and manipulate their body is the same as any child. What happens is that sometimes they're not able to access the instruction provided on how to move their body. So if you think about a general PE class, the kid who's blind can't just watch and do like their peers with sight. So they might miss out on the teacher demonstrating how to hop or jump or skip or kick a ball. And this causes them to be less likely to participate in games or activities that require these gross motor skills, these basic skills, because they don't know how, or they haven't properly been taught how to do these things. So these movement skills, these motor development skills, need to be hands-on, tactile, and all within the arm's reach of the student. This is how we're going to create instruction that's accessible and meaningful for these students. That being said, during early development, students with visual impairment do lack information about the world around them. I was talking before about the underdeveloped concept of object permanence, and without this information, how the student might show limited curiosity, they might not explore as much, and they might lack purposeful movement. So going back to an example with a baby with typical vision, sees a bright toy or a bright ball and is motivated to reach out or to move towards the toy. But a blind baby does not have that motivation. So how would they even know that the toy was there if it doesn't make any sound? Something else is that students with vision impairment often need to be encouraged to reach across midline. So that's with the right hand reaching across to the left side, for example. Now passing on to Rebecca.
Sorry, try to join a little early there, Shelby. All right, so we're going to dive into social skill development. So early childhood processes, play may be heavily impacted. We know that children with visual impairments and blindness often exhibit reduced pretend play skills and symbolic play, pretending one item is another item. And this really comes from a lack of being able to watch adults and imitate them. And that carries on into their social play as they get a little bit older. Their pretend play is impacted. They may not be able to join their peers. They may not see what their peers are doing and be able to imitate them, or they may be isolated. They may not have a lot of experiences or opportunities to be around other peers. And turn taking can really require explicit teaching. These problems can really start in infancy. We know parents and caregivers, they tend to look at a baby, make that eye contact, and then that social smile, that back and forth social reciprocity can really begin. And a lot of times parents may not know how to establish that back and forth that we naturally engage in and have to shift it to being vocal. So that is the first turn taking, first communicative experience, and attachment itself can be at risk in those early stages. And then later childhood, the play skills will continue to impact social relationships. If turn taking has not been explicitly taught yet, that of course is going to continue to be a problem in play, in social interactions, making friendships. And children may start to prefer adult interactions to their peers. Adults tend to be more predictable, their conversations are easier to navigate. Adults will let children stay within their narrow topics of comfort, and it's a little bit safer, whereas other children might not want to talk about their narrow scope. They may change the topic too frequently. They may not be able to read their facial expressions. So those chances may dwindle as the child prefers adult interactions. And then in adolescence, of course, all of those impacts are going to continue, and those narrow interests may continue. And we now live in this technological world. We may not think about teaching a typical teenager how to text, how to use social media, but those are ways to engage with their friends. And with our blind and visually impaired children, if they don't have that access, the ability to text a friend, email a friend on their own, they're really limited in their independence and their ability to maintain friendships. So social interactions need to be explicitly taught, especially physical ones. We think about handshakes and high fives. How can we give a cue, a touch cue to the elbow or the forearm to let a person know that someone around them would like to shake their hand? Next slide, thank you. Okay, so language development, of course, is closely related to social development. We know that being blind, especially from birth, can impact a variety of language skills and developmental processes from infancy through adolescence. Nearly all five areas of language can be impacted. Semantics, the meanings of words, syntax, putting those together, morphology, the pieces of words, phonology, the sounds, and pragmatics, the use of language. But I'm just going to discuss some key areas to be aware of. I could easily do a whole presentation on language and visual impairment, so keep in mind these are just some priorities that I selected. We know that this is a quote from a 1983 article, which is dated but still relevant, and it says, where relevant experience is lacking, concepts cannot develop, and where concepts are lacking, word meanings cannot be learned. And that is a really key thing to keep in mind when you're looking at language in our population. So I mentioned semantics, the meaning of words. Sometimes you might see it referred to hollow language or having a loose understanding of a word. Shelby mentioned this with the car example. Another example would be a tree. A student might be able to touch it, smell it, hear the leaves, but they have no idea how big the tree is, the colors or the creatures living inside it, the different kinds of trees and the categories. All that related vocabulary doesn't exist without very explicit teaching. Children with visual impairments also often struggle with abstract words, words where the meaning is totally dependent on language. Words like love and truth, they don't have a concrete reference. We also see an issue with what some people call far away words, words that are too far, too large, or too dangerous to actually touch and experience. The moon is an example, rivers, a fire, something a student cannot actually experience is hard to understand as a whole concept. We also want to talk about comprehension. Something that is often impacted is the ability to understand parts of a whole. An example would be a sandwich, the bread and what's inside the sandwich. And then having that student understand that the person next to them might have a sandwich with completely different things inside. I recently saw this with a student I was working with. We were discussing a pizza and I asked her what shape it was. And she said a triangle. And I repeated this with a few other students. And to me, when I think pizza, I think circle. And for these children, they've never experienced a pizza as a whole. So pizza is a triangle, and teaching them that it is actually just a piece of a whole. And we also see describing, comparing, and contrasting impacted. We know that these kids don't have the vast visual knowledge bank that their typically sighted peers have. So they can't identify salient features as easily. They can't pick out things to compare and contrast. And I mentioned categories already, but a great example a colleague gave to me was a cup. The child knows that their item in their hand is a cup. They might not know that mom's coffee mug and dad's water glass and mom's coffee container in the car are also within that category of cup. Because they don't see them all together on the shelf, they don't understand that they're all serving the same purpose. They may have no idea that those different words are within the same category. Expressive language is really tied into all this, but I wanted to pick up a few things you might see. Scripting is very common in our population, repeating phrases and songs, commercial jingles, echolalia as well. It really comes down to language play often, but it's something that can also be seen of course, in autism and other diagnoses. So it's important for us to be aware that this can also be caused by vision impairments. And then lastly, the higher level language difficulties inferencing information that's not directly stated. This goes back to a limited world experience, not being able to attach experience to some of these things that they're expected to infer both in day-to-day life and on standardized assessments. And and then non-literal language such as sarcasm that really requires facial expressions.
Okay, my turn. I'm going to talk a little bit about cognitive processing. So cognitive processing includes thinking, knowing, remembering, judging, and problem solving. I'm just going to give a few examples of how cognitive processing can be impacted by a student's visual impairment. So a student with a visual impairment might still be primarily a visual learner. If that's the case, depending on how much functional vision they have and are able to use, they may need specific instruction on interpreting things tactually. So that's why we do a lot of, with early intervention and really with any student, a lot of tactual development activities to kind of boost that sense. It's important to carefully attend to differences in performance between comprehension based on memory, such as answering a question by repeating words from a passage verbatim, and comprehension based on reasoning or making inferences, such as understanding. I've assessed students who can attain very high levels on reading passages. Their prosody and fluidity are really impressive when they're reading. They can answer the simple who, what, and where questions, but they're unable to answer why questions or extrapolate theories or inferences beyond what is explicitly stated. The next slide is about executive functioning development. And on the slide, we have, there's a lot of all the different areas of executive functioning. So those include planning, organization, self-control, task initiation, time management, metacognition, working memory, attention, flexibility, and perseverance. So that's a lot. That's a really long list. I've seen all of these pictured areas of executive functioning be impacted by students with visual impairments. Organization is huge. Students with visual impairments don't have the benefit of observing how their peers and family members organize. They need explicit instruction for organizational skills, which are so important. So imagine trying to find your history folder in a deep, dark backpack when there is no color coding or organizational system. The simple task of using colored folders, braille, or large print labels can make a huge difference. Many students' executive functioning skills are often limited by over-reliance on paraprofessionals or others who are overly helpful. So if any of you have had us come in, the assessment center come into your school, or you've had members on your team who are kind of trying to reel in that paraprofessional, this is a big reason why. We just see that students really become too reliant in so many different areas, and it's really important that these students learn their own skills of organization, management, listening to the teacher, and they experience exactly what their peers are experiencing. And I could go on and on about that issue, but I'm not going to. Working memory is the ability to store and manage information in the short term to carry out complex tasks. A student who is sighted can access visual supports to assist their recall, but a student with a visual impairment may need to rely on their working memory. Again, I've worked with many students who over-rely on their working memory and need tips and encouragement, such as learning to write things down to assist their working memory. We'll talk a little bit about sensory processing. So there's a picture on the slide with an ear representing hearing, an eye representing vision, a hand for touch, a nose for smell. Did I get them all? An ear for hearing. So, oh, a tongue for taste. I know I missed one. So some students, especially those with multiple disabilities and cortical visual impairment, are often sensitive to too much sensory stimuli. It's difficult for these students to focus on more than one stimuli at a time. For many, they can either listen or use their remaining vision or explore something tactually, but they can't do it all at once. And we need to keep that in mind during assessment, educational time, because that's really important. Self-stimulatory behaviors such as eye pressing, rocking, and hand flapping can be due to either over or under stimulation. Providing sensory breaks in a swing or hammock can be really helpful, as can fidget tools for eye pressing. The next slide. Talk a little, oh, it's May's turn. Go ahead, May.
Thanks, Stephanie. Alrighty, and of course, this month of May is Mental Health Awareness Month. So of course, we're going to touch on mental health development. So students with visual impairments may struggle to adjust to their disability. They may need support to explore the intersectionality of their visual impairment, culture, gender orientation, sexual orientation, race, physical ability, and nationality to gain an integrated sense of self. Children with visual impairments are at increased risk for experiencing mental health challenges when compared to their sighted peers, and this has been found in multiple research findings. Having the lack or limited access to incidental learning opportunities can contribute to the challenges our students might encounter in developing social, emotional, and communication skills like Rebecca just mentioned. So these daily living activities, such as accessing materials and negotiating social and physical environments, may cause anxiety and stress. So it's really important that we provide early intervention and vision-specific services to improve their daily functioning and social participation. And once we provide them the tools and strategies to use, these may positively impact other aspects of their well-being, such as overall quality of life and psychosocial functioning. And what has been found to be important to improving good mental health in all children are friendships, leisure time activities, and independence and mobility. So it's really important that we not only focus on the academic component of education, but also the behavioral and social emotional components. Some other impacts of visual impairments include sleep. So many students with visual impairments have disruptions of their circadian rhythms or their day and night rhythm. Close to 90 to 100% of children with visual impairments suffer from sleep-related conditions, and this is from Good Sleep Strategies from Perkins eLearning. They have a great little video about sleep, and it's a good practice. Mass Communique had a recent article about this, actually, about including sleep questions in our assessments. So there's different assessments like the BEARS, and I have it linked in our handout, which asks specific questions about the quality of sleep and presence of different sleep hygiene routines. Whenever I transition a student to my testing office, I usually ask them how well they slept the night before and what they had for breakfast to see if their basic human needs were met before we launch into all of our activities. Another concern or area that is impacting our students is safety. There are some more obvious safety concerns that Shelby will be addressing a little bit when she speaks about O&M, or orientation and mobility. But due to some physical concerns, students with visual impairments might be overprotected and not provided dignity of risk, being allowed to explore and play and try to be involved in physical activities as much as possible. And being overprotected could lead to hesitancy in initiation, exploration, and feelings of frustration or inadequacy. Having routines and providing pre-teaching and knowledge can help provide a sense of predictability and safety, and provide opportunities to allow choice. Also provides our students a sense of agency and control. So much of our students who have very traumatic early life experiences and had to go through many medical operations or procedures a lot of things have been done to them. We don't want to do things to them. We want to do things with them, provide interventions with them so that they can learn the skills to become independent and competent. And I'm going to hand it over to Shelby.
Great, thanks, May. So the expanded core curriculum is a specialized curriculum for students with visual impairment. It addresses the knowledge and skills needed by students with visual impairments due to their unique disability and specific needs. There's 9 skill areas that are included in this, and they are required to require direct teaching in order for students to access the Common Core curriculum and to function independently in life. These were covered in the More Than Meets the Eye video, so I'm just going to quickly run through them now. One is assistive technology, career education, compensatory skills, independent living, orientation and mobility, recreation and leisure, sensory efficiency, self-determination, and social interaction. TVIs and O&Ms, or orientation mobility specialists, are typically responsible for assessing and teaching these skills, but they may request support from other team members in order to help facilitate and document progress on these. Ensuring that the expanded core curriculum is included in a student's educational programming is one way to address this issue. Okay, so we have gotten through our kind of quick and easy introduction to visual impairments. Let's take a few minutes for questions, and then we're gonna have a break. So just so you guys know that the break is coming up for 5 minutes. So if you don't have any questions and you want this time to kind of go grab a snack or take a stretch, then now would be the time to do that.
I'm just going to throw in real quick. We do have a little bit of room left in the webinar for participants. So if you know somebody that wasn't able to get in through Facebook Live, they can now log in now. I think there's room for about 40 or 50 from what I heard.
And we had one question earlier that what do you know about developmental optometrists and problems with eye teaming? And I actually have not heard of developmental optometrists. So that is something that I'm going to look into after this to get a better idea about it. When I think of problems with eye teaming, I think about that it's typically a binocular vision specialist that's going to look at this, and it's an ocular motor, so how the eyes are actually being controlled and moving. If you're in California or in the Northern California area, UC Berkeley has a binocular vision clinic, and they're great at addressing things like that, but that is like outside of that's more in the motor aspect of things, so not what the TVI would focus on. See if there's any others. Oh, thank you, Rajiv. Developmental optometry is often connected with vision therapy. Thanks for that. And I don't know if we have any other questions. So let's go ahead. We're going to start. So now we're going to take a 5-minute break, and you can choose your own adventure, choose your own 5 minutes. So we're going to play a video. It's a really cute little audio described animated video about Pip, who's a guide dog in training. Audio description is a tool that gives students with visual impairments access to information in a video. So feel free to watch this, or like I said before, use this time to go stretch, grab a snack, run to the restroom.
Words appear on screen. Southeastern Guide Dogs presents. Our view is of Southeastern Guide Dogs Canine University. We see Pip, a small yellow Labrador, walking alone through large iron gates. A group of puppies rush onto campus, jostling Pip. Pip walks through open doors into a grand university hall. She walks along a wall of framed memorabilia. Slowly, Pip admires each piece of history. When suddenly she's stopped, a trainer points toward a minimum height requirement. Pip strains to be tall enough, but only her ear hits the mark. The trainer allows a joyful Pip into class. Title appears, Pip. In the classroom, Pip jumps up trying to see over her desk. Then she guides her blindfolded trainer past a series of cones, but walks her into a plastic pole and the trainer hits the floor. Pip learns to push a button to dispense kibble into a bowl. The kibble overflows and Pip desperately tries to stop it. Pip guides her blindfolded trainer who trips over a step. Pip tries to answer a question in class but slips from her desk. Her kibble overflows again and she trips her trainer again. Pip looks up, worried. We now see Pip alone in front of the Wall of Fame. Pip looks at a photo of Ace. It says Ace leads the pack. Her eyes widen and she begins to smile. She successfully fills her kibble bowl. She sits taller on a stack of books at her desk, and she learns to properly guide her trainer. Pip's trainer kneels to praise her. An indoor testing area is set with obstacles. A banner reads, Exam Day. The stern director of training sits behind a desk and motions for Pip. She steps forward. We see Pip wearing a guide dog harness. She successfully guides her trainer past obstacles. Proud of how well the test is going, Pip looks up at her trainer and causes her to trip. Pip is ushered from the testing area. She looks over her shoulder upset. Outside, Pip hangs her head. She stops at the statue of hero dog Ace. Pip's sad gaze falls on a woman with a white cane walking outside the gates. Pip turns away and walks to the classroom window where she watches her classmates graduate. Her 2 teardrops hit the window pane. Pip turns from the window to see the woman disoriented and in danger at a construction site. Pip runs at top speed, squeezes under the campus gate, and slips her head between the woman's purse straps, using it as a makeshift harness. She guides the woman safely through the construction zone, leading her to the sidewalk. The woman kneels and pets Pip. Our view sweeps back to Canine University. Pip's trainer, classmates, and director applaud her heroic act. Pip rejoins her class. The director removes the blue cape from the statue of Ace and ties it on Pip, while the other pups look on in admiration. The trainer smiles, and Pip looks up proudly and poses just like Ace, one paw up, head tilted. The Southeastern Guide Dog's logo and words appear. Our dogs save the day every day for people with vision loss and veterans with disabilities. Screen fades to black, words appear. Film made possible. Words appear on screen. Southeastern Guide Dog. Words appear on screen. Southeastern Guide.
Looks like a little bit of technical difficulty there. All right, so hopefully you had a moment to stretch a little bit. I know I need to do that. So we're getting back into our presentation as I put in the chat, we're going to talk a little bit about the evaluation process. And then a couple of people have had questions if we're going to talk about specific tools for assessments. And yes, hang tight, we're getting there. So we will definitely do that. And you have tons of information once you delve into your handouts about all sorts of tools. So you should be covered on that front, and we'll get there shortly. So I have a quote up on the screen. It says, "Alone we can do so little, together we can do so much." And that's a pretty famous quote from Helen Keller. Evaluating a student with visual impairments with a transdisciplinary approach is crucial. Each evaluator brings the lens of their area of expertise to identifying the student's strengths and needs. Collaboration among all the evaluators will facilitate an effective problem-solving process, produce meaningful results and recommendations, and lead to a cohesive, holistic plan to support the student. Capitalize on the knowledge that family members bring to the evaluation process and integrate their input. I'm going to talk a little bit about what each of our roles are within the evaluation process. It's important to understand that the TVI's role on the evaluation team for a student with a visual impairment. TVIs have expertise in visual impairments and their impacts on development and functioning. They provide both direct service, indirect service, and consultation. TVIs provide guidance on what students can access visually, how to adapt materials, determine the most appropriate learning media, and assistive technology. There are two main assessments the TVI will complete as part of every triennial. Those are the Functional Vision Assessment, or FVA, and the Learning Media Assessment, the LMA. Ideally, the FVA is completed prior to any other assessment so that the information obtained can be used to provide the most up-to-date information on how the student is using his or her vision in the classroom and school environments. The LMA is used to monitor that the reading media, whether it be print, braille, audio, or a combination of any of those, being used is the most appropriate reading media. It's important to note that most TVI training programs, at least in California, do not include training in standardized assessment procedures. And this is unlike other teacher specialist disciplines. TVIs examine reading media, while RSP teachers and SDC teachers or psychologists examine reading disabilities. Knowing this difference may help explain why TVIs don't conduct standardized assessments. That being said, the TVI should be asked to help a psychologist during administration if the student needs modification, such as braille or large print, to make sure the testing materials are accessible. Again, collaboration is the key. We definitely can't say that enough.
Next, moving on to orientation and mobility. So the orientation and mobility specialist role is to conduct an O&M assessment with the student. They're going to evaluate the student's ability to know where they are and how they get to where they want to go. So they're going to look at current O&M skills, which could include how they move around indoors, how they are guided or guide somebody else by holding onto the arm, if they are crossing streets, taking public transportation, shopping, concept development, and long cane or adaptive mobility device travel. So that could be somebody who doesn't have a standard long cane, but have a device in front of them to help keep them safe when they move. They're also going to look at how the student uses any functional vision that they have. And the TVI, while they're really focusing in the classroom, the O&M is focusing in the community. And they are conducting their assessment in a variety of environments. And this includes both or all in the home, the school, and in the community as appropriate. The goal of this is to determine if the student would benefit from receiving instruction and how to make themselves as safe and independent as possible. And that safe and independent as possible is really key. So it's going to look different for each individual student. The O&M specialist also informs IEP team members about how to appropriately guide a student and the safest ways to support a student when they're traveling on campus. This is especially true when you're working with new students who you don't know yet. So if you're not sure how the student gets from place to place, ask them, or you can ask their O&M specialist about the best way to walk with this student on campus. You might need to go to the classroom to get them and guide them to where you're testing, or the student might be able to visually follow you, or maybe they can even meet you at the destination. One thing I like to note too is that some vision professionals are dually certified. So they may be a teacher of students with visual impairments and an orientation mobility specialist and provide both services for students.
All right, so the speech and language pathologist role. I have another quote here. This is from a 2010 systematic review on communication in preschool children with VI. And it says, the greater the degree of visual impairment, the more likely children with visual impairment are to present with early social and communication difficulties. This really highlights the importance of making sure there is somebody specialized in language on your team. And for SLPs means collaborate, which we will keep saying over and over throughout our presentation. Collaborate, especially with the TVI, if you're planning to adapt any materials, and we're going to touch more on that very soon. And with the psychologist, there's a lot of overlapping areas in both of our testing. The SLP's role will depend a lot on the individual needs of the child, and I discussed a lot of the language development earlier today, But some areas frequently impacted that the SLP will look at will be early play skills and development, social development, pragmatic language, expressive and receptive vocabulary, auditory comprehension, reading comprehension, higher level language, and narrative and storytelling. And there are other areas in the speech and language pathologist field that may not be directly impacted by vision, such as speech sounds and articulation, but the SLP will still evaluate as necessary. We don't see yet in the research any correlation between speech sound disorders and vision loss, but keep in mind that if a child does have an articulation error, some of our typical strategies are very visual, and so you have to account for that. And you're going to want to have your SLP participate in discussions of some of those behaviors, like I said, that could be VI, that could be typical, that could be language impairment, autism, ADD, all those overlapping diagnoses. Make sure that that is an open conversation. And the SLP testing, like I said, overlaps a lot with the psychologist testing, the verbal intelligence, crystallized intelligence. So consult whenever possible. Compare your results if you have overlapping areas that were tested. Or if you're doing a collaborative approach, you can consider dividing up the overlapping areas to save time and ease some of the burden of testing on the child.
Just to make sure we get through our presentation, we're going to skip through that question very really quick, since a lot of your questions will be addressed through our content on the coming slides. So sometimes being a school psychologist feels like we need to be a jack of all trades. We're a consultant, collaborator, evaluator, researcher, data analyst, counselor, program manager, advocate, and even spy. That's what a student thought when I was observing in a classroom with a trench coat on one time. I thought it was so adorable. They're like, shh, that's a spy. So depending on what setting you work in, your role may lean towards one of these roles more than the other. And the beauty of being a school psychologist is the diversity of experiences we have the opportunity to learn from, since a school psychologist will be involved in most team evaluations, unless it's a speech-only evaluation. So for example, I worked in local school districts before coming to the California School for the Blind, which included providing evaluations for children residing at a regional subacute medical facility. We bring our knowledge and experience from our previous evaluations and practices to our future ones. And knowledge of how to assess students with visual impairments can help you when you assess any of your other students on your caseload. So in terms of our role in evaluation, we should recognize that all evaluators bring knowledge of child development and education and specialized interventions and supports to evaluations from the lens of their respective fields. The content areas where school psychologists may be responsible for may vary from district to district, but can include the following: cognition, processing, academic achievement. And some districts have special education teachers, such as the resource specialist, special day class teacher, specialized academic instructor, or like Kara mentioned in the chat, if a TVI has had specific training through a university program or several district in-service trainings, they may also be able to provide assessment with those specific tools that they have been trained in and been provided supervised training opportunities. Some other areas that a psychologist may be looking at is social emotional and behavioral functioning and adaptive behaviors. So adaptive behaviors fall into the realm along that align with the ECC, the expanded core curriculum of daily living skills or independent living skills. So there are many components that psychs might be looking at that overlap with other evaluation team members, such as speech language pathologists, OTPT, and TDI and OMers when we're looking at different areas of the ECC. And of course, you always want to involve parents and family members in your evaluation process. They are the experts on their child. So of course, we need to bring in their expertise as well. And when we're looking at the differences and similarities between evaluation team members, like I mentioned, some team members such as OTs, PTs, speech language pathologists, psychologists, and if they've been specifically trained, TIs and OMers might be providing information about statistics and psychometrics. In our graduate programs, as we received a foundation in administering and interpreting standardized assessments. But where we need help, and it's always important to know when it is appropriate to seek out consultation, it's how to provide appropriate access. Our graduate programs often maybe to just do a class or one lecture, skimming through low incident disabilities. Luckily, some local universities, they might do a field trip when in-person contact is appropriate and safe, to our campus or to the California School for the Deaf as well. And we appreciate those opportunities to share our knowledge with our graduate students. But a lot of times it's just a brief moment in time and there's not a lot of in-depth knowledge or time allowed for in-depth review of visual impairments or other low incidence disabilities. And as you probably have seen so far, visual impairments can be quite complex. The level of functionality between one student with visual impairments may greatly differ from another student, just like within the sighted community. And so one thing that all psychs most likely have that is a resource that you can refer to is, I'm holding up the book Foundations of Behavioral and Social and Clinical Assessment of Children by Jerome Sattler. And actually Carol, who is in our attendance today, she actually co-authored chapter 20, which looks at visual impairments and assessment. So if you're a psych, you most likely have this book on your bookshelf somewhere. Go to it and look at it. Also in our handout, we have many different resources that you can access online, as well as some other books that you may find very helpful in learning how to assess students with visual impairments. One of them is Collaborative Assessments. This was written by a team at California School for the Blind. And these titles are in the handout, and we can also drop it in the chat as well. And also, making evaluations meaningful. It was published earlier in the 2000s and it's going through a revision right now. According to the Texas School for the Blind website, their store says that the new edition should be coming out in August 2021. So in a few months, Marnie Lofton, another giant in our field, is working on that one. So I'm really excited. Some people call that their assessment Bible for VI. So another great resource. But I would wait until the new edition is going to come out because it's coming out real soon. Other great resources include the document from APH about intellectual testing, and you can access that for free online. And we included a link to that in our handout. And that one was written by several giants, so including Stephen Goodman and Carol Evans, and I believe Marnie Lofton. And just want to make sure, okay. And when we're looking at performing our analyses of eligibility, remember that, we don't operate in a vacuum. We need to have collaborative discussions about eligibility. Our speech language pathologist friends also do a lot of work about eligibility, as well as other team members have a lot to contribute. So we don't want to operate in a vacuum. We really want to emphasize collaborating. And Jessica, did you need? Oh, okay. And I'm going to hand it off to Rebecca.
Great, thank you. And I saw a few people hoping you could just type the title of the book in the chat. All right, so as May said, this is a collaboration, a full team effort. Some of the other team members, but probably not all of them, are going to be APE, assistive technology professionals, AAC professionals, deaf and hard of hearing specialists, your OTs, your PTs, ELL teachers, RSP, SDC, special education teachers, behaviorists. And if I missed you, please put it in the chat because we really want to emphasize that everyone working with the child should be involved in the assessment. Oh, and parents. I didn't put parents on there. We really want to make sure that everyone's involved and that you all know how important you are in this process.
So we have a couple of general, more than a couple, but general suggestions for interactions. For those of you that have never had the opportunity to work with a student who's visually impaired, these are just some things to keep in mind. So first of all, well, let me just share the picture on the screen real quick is someone guiding a person who's visually impaired up a staircase, and then another picture going sighted guide. So identify yourself when you arrive. For example, just say, "Hi, Susie, it's Mrs. Ehrlich." Please refrain from quizzing a student. I cringe every time I hear someone do this, you know, the "do you know who I am" question. Also, let the student know when you are leaving the room. It's a simple statement of, "Hey, Matt, I'm just leaving for a moment to go get another book." When the student enters the room, tell them where their chair is. Ask if they want to be guided to their spot. You can just simply say, "There's a table in front of you and the chair's on the opposite side. Would you like me to show you where to go?" Before touching a student for guidance, let them know, you know, "Can I show you where the graphic is?" And so that's an example of, you know, don't just take a student's hand and put it on a paper, make sure you let them know. And always be specific with descriptions. You can let them know the picture on the page is above the sentence that you're reading, or the hook for your cane is to the left of the door, and that's way more descriptive than "it's over there." And don't be afraid to use words such as look or see. They're part of our general vocabulary. If you've got a jokester on your hands, they might give you a hard time, but it's okay to use those words, look or see. And use a typical speaking voice. You don't need to speak any louder. And another really key one is if there's multiple people in the room, if there's a parent who's brought the student or the paraprofessional, talk to the student. Don't talk, you know, about the student to the other person. Make sure you're addressing the student.
All right, so it's time to plan for the evaluation. So recognize that time is really needed to plan accordingly, and that testing will probably take longer than you're typically used to. And as we've said forever now, consult with your whole team. Make sure you review whatever your most recent ophthalmologist or optometrist reports are, and consider and review any additional medical information that might suggest presence of conditions additional to vision impairment. Ideally, the TVI's evaluation is prioritized and given first, so that other team members can use their findings and test with the most appropriate materials and accommodations, which you're going to get to. Review the functional vision assessment and the learning media assessment from the TVI, and make sure you consult with them about supports, which again, we're going to talk about much more in depth. So you're going to want to think about positioning of materials, lighting requirements, visual fatigue, positioning of items in the environment in relation to the student, and make sure you've thought out your assistive technology. Make sure that your room is set up for it, that you have everything, all the cables and plugs that you need, and make sure that you have access to what the student uses on a daily basis. Don't just go off the IEP. There might be things listed in the IEP the student does not actually use or doesn't like to use or has outgrown. So make sure you're up to date with what they are using as their technology. And consider if you have students with CVI, that testing in an unfamiliar environment can be really uncomfortable, and that external stimuli might be distracting. And even for children without CVI, being in a new place with new sounds and new things to visually distract them can really make testing a much harder experience. Okay, so we don't have a formal poll for this, but put in the chat, in the context of evaluation, what do you think RIOT stands for? We have righteous invasion of truth. Oh, we do have a formal poll. Recovery and outpatient therapy, records review, interview, observation, and testing, radical image optimization tool, and revolution in our time. And Facebook people, you can throw your comments in there too. Okay, we got about half of our people replied. All right, most of you have got the right answer. I want a few more people to chime in first. All right, so we got 96% with the correct answer there. The answer is records review, interview, observation, and testing. So May actually made the slide, and the first and last are actually band names. And the last one, the fourth one, I guess, is something about compressing images. So we are going to pass this off to May.
Thanks, Rebecca. And so RIOT might be a familiar acronym for many evaluators. Dr. Brian Young, in his 1993 article, wrote that assessment is a riot. So always remembering to do your records review, interview, observations, and then testing in that order. And so he actually published an article in 2020 about when you can't riot, Rio, which is very relevant for our time right now with COVID-19, but also is very important to think about when it is difficult to perform standardized assessments. And so if you are in an early career psych, you might have been trained in RIOT ISIL, but if you were trained maybe 10 years ago or something like that, you might not have heard of RIOT ISIL yet. And so when we're looking at doing assessments that are thorough and comprehensive, we want to use a multi-method, multiple informant approach to the evaluation and gather data across settings such as the physical environments and social environments over time. And so using a RIOT ISIL approach to assessments help ensure that we are getting those multiple sources of information and analyzing them throughout the assessment. And another key idea about using this approach is that it takes a social justice lens to our evaluation practice. It shifts the focus beyond the learner and standardized assessments where our focus typically is in our trainings, but we need to look beyond the numbers for meaningful data. And if you feel like we're being really repetitive with some of our concepts, we're doing that on purpose because we know that repetition can aid memory. And we really do need to look beyond standard scores and look for meaningful data in our assessment. And the APH guideline that I popped into the chat and is also linked in our handout provides a lot of great guidance on when it might be appropriate to report standard scores and interpret them, and it might be better to interpret your assessments qualitatively, using them as clinical observations instead. And if you have questions about RIOT ISIL, there's also links in the handout that describe this model, this problem-solving model in great detail. But in looking at our time, I'm going to kind of whiz through many of our slides to try to get through the majority of our content today. So I apologize if I'm going a little fast. Okay, so first we're going to look at records review of how we can review instruction, curriculum, and environment, and then the learner. We're like detectives looking for patterns or clues here. And when we're doing our file reviews, it can feel like we're looking at a yellow page book. Some of our students have piles and piles of records, especially if we are getting up into high school or students who have many early start services or lots of medical challenges. So it can be overwhelming sometimes when we're looking at the piles of records. But what's important is we need to try to focus on key points that help us build a profile of the student's significant features in their educational and medical, social emotional history, as well as their family. And so when we're looking at instructions, we want to see which instruction strategies were noted to work or not work well for the student through report cards or past IEPs, and consider if meaningful access was provided for instruction. Were students being provided pre-teaching opportunities? Was that noted in the IEP's accommodation strategies? For curriculum, you want to review what kind of accommodations were implemented to adapt the curriculum, like Braille, large print, audiobooks, tactile graphics, 3D models, real objects. When we're looking at the environment, you want to see, in the IEP, is it documented what kind of environmental setting was recommended for the student? What kind of maybe positioning the student away from the window to, be mindful of glare, or How was the service delivered? Push in, pull out, group or individual? And also when we're looking at our records, looking at if they had any peer mentors assisting them with their learning, look at their attendance record to look for patterns. And when we're looking at the learner, we want to see if there's significant findings in their medical records, such as changes in their vision, the original cause of their visual impairment. Reviewing the records allow for a more comprehensive understanding of the student and a higher quality evaluation. And when we're looking through our records, you can look for things like when you're knowledgeable about common causes of CVI or cortical visual impairment, if you see things like, having a very traumatic birth experience where there was a lack of oxygen, or different traumatic incidences like concussions or many invasive medical treatments, and you are starting to see some of those characteristics of CVI, you might want to consult with your TBI about maybe asking them about, are they looking at the various CVI characteristics in their evaluation? And now we're going to jump into interviews. So again, like we mentioned earlier, getting inputs from classroom teachers and parents is very important. And sometimes interviewing jointly with other evaluators might be more efficient, since we do have a lot of overlap in the questions that we may be asking from a SLP lens, a psych lens, or TBI or an M lens. So when we're looking at instructions, we want to look at the sequencing and pace of instructions. Were the students allowed different ways to show what they know? Were there different reinforcement or incentive or engagement strategy used? When we're looking at the curriculum, was there coverage of Common Core curriculum as well as expanded core curriculum, the ECC? How was technology integrated into the curriculum? And looking at if any specific changes to the room layout were done to accommodate the students, such as having space for their brailler or having a hook on the wall for their cane, things like that. And looking at the level of family and school collaboration. When we're talking with parents, like I mentioned earlier, it's very important to ask about routines around healthy behavior, such as sleeping, nutrition, physical activity, and social connection. Are they involved in any extracurricular activities? There's so many great opportunities for our students with visual impairments to connect with other students with visual impairments through Society for the Blind, Lighthouse, and I'm going to say ABC, but ACB and other organizations. They have a lot of online opportunities now. That's one of our silver linings of COVID. There are so many opportunities for our students to connect with one another. And there's even national hotlines to connect some of our older students who are in high school to talk with people who are in the field who have visual impairments and have been successful in their post-secondary education or in their careers, to provide advice for that major transition to adult life. And also, of course, we want to interview the student too and get their perspectives around, how they feel in terms of being comfortable with doing self-advocacy, how they feel about adjusting to their visual impairment and other needs, and how they feel about their friendships and connections at school and within the community. How much are they asked to do chores or have other responsibilities in the home, and what are their aspirations? And I included in our handout some sample questions that you can ask in your interview. It's quite a long document. And again, I recognize that you might not go through all those questions, but they're provided to provide some idea. And when we're talking with parents, of course, asking about their independent living skills. And it's useful to ask the parent about independent living skills and then also check in with the student, because sometimes they say, yeah, I could do that. And then we're like, okay, so how do you do it? And then it's like, maybe, you can do part of it, but actually someone else really supports you through the first couple steps and then you finish it. So we want to help promote your independence with the initial steps as well. And this also, independent living skills, that applies to the skills shown in class. So whenever possible, it's nice if we can actually see a demonstration of some skills through our assessment, but I know that's not always possible, and we are under a time constraint in schools with high assessment caseloads. So again, we're talking about best practices here, which would be optimal in an ideal testing situation, but we understand that some of these ideas might not always be possible. So we're going to move on to observations. Observations are very important if you want your evaluation to be legally defensible. So in our evaluations, of course, we work as teams, and we all bring our different lenses of expertise and perspectives to the table. So our insights to observations, even though we're all observing the same situation, might be different and are invaluable to understanding the child. So when you are observing, please try to observe for at least 20-minute periods. Better if it's longer, but at least 20 minutes. And I get this 20-minute information from Carl Corbin, the attorney I was mentioning earlier. You want to have observations in multiple settings, across different times, you know, small group, whole group, maybe independent work or whole group work, and know who is in the environment. The things that you need to have a legally defensible write-up for your observation includes the time of observation, length of observation, again, at least 20 minutes. What were the general education students doing? What were the special education students doing? And what was the student who's the target of the evaluation doing? And there are different types of structured observations or unstructured, but some of the things to look out for is what supports are needed to maintain engagement. Are they maintaining and sustaining attention and engagement independently, or their supports needed? How much is their instructional assistant or paraprofessional involved in prompting the student? A lot of students who are in mainstream education classrooms might have an aide to assist with different parts of their day. And a lot of times our paraprofessionals, they are such wonderful, kind, passionate, caring people, and they really want to help, but sometimes we need to step back to help more. We need to try to allow the students the opportunity to provide their best effort. And if they make a mistake, we need to encourage that it's okay to have a growth mindset, that it's okay to make mistakes, and we can learn what to do better next time. Because it's better to know what the student knows and is still emerging in knowledge, rather than doing something 100% correct, but that was maybe motored through the task or overly prompted through the task. Other things in the environment that we want to make sure we look at are interactions with peers and adults. And I'm going to move on now to our next portion about tests. And Shelby, I'll go to our question break first.
Yeah, we're actually going to continue on, May, because looking at the questions that we have, they're going to be covered in the following topics. So I think we are good to go for now.
Great, thanks. I saw I had 26 texts, but I wasn't able to read it. Thank you for that. All right, so we're going to move straight on to testing. So when we're looking at testing from a Riot ISIL kind of model, when we're looking at instruction, we can be using dynamic assessment measures. So you might do pre-testing for baseline data, and then do some training or intervention, and then post-testing to determine learning potential or different ways to help the students learn efficiently. We're looking at curriculum. We can evaluate the student's response to curriculum-based measurements. Some examples of that are like Evals or Ames Web. When we're looking at the environment, we want to compare learning and behavior across settings and determine which subject areas or settings that the student responds well to or exhibits more challenges. And when we're assessing, and we might have already mentioned this, but we want to assess in all areas of suspected need. So this could include academic achievement, cognitive abilities and processing, social, emotional, or behavioral functioning, including self-awareness and self-advocacy, functional vision, learning media, assistive technology, orientation and mobility, and of course, those vision-specific areas would be evaluated by our TVI and O&M friends. I like to say when I'm doing consultations with psychs throughout the state of California that your TVI is your best friend during an evaluation. You should be consulting with your TVI throughout the whole process, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. Other areas that might be assessed include sensory processing, gross and fine motor skills, attention, and executive functioning. So tests may be formal or informal and can be norm reference or criterion reference. So what that means is you might be doing tests that are standardized and produce scaled scores or standard scores, or do something like the Oregon or the Southern California Ordinal Scales development to look at things from a criterion-based reference. Other ways of assessing include rating scales and checklists. And when appropriate practices are followed, cognitive or intelligence testing of individuals who are blind and visually impaired provides useful and valuable data to the students and their families and instructors and other decision makers. So it is possible, but we need to be very careful. And so I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca.
Okay, so we are all curious on if you have any tests that you have used on blind and visually impaired students, whether they are meant for that or you've adapted them. Go ahead and throw some of your favorites into the chat, and you will see in our handout links to resources that May and I have created, one for psychologists and one for SLPs, with some standardized assessments and non-standardized assessments that can be used with this population. I know, okay, so I see the Woodcock Johnson has a Braille format, yep, and it also has a large print format. I know personally in the SLP world that the oral passage and understanding scale, the Opus, is one of my favorites. I see Brugant's Braille format, the Oregon, yep, absolutely. Oh, the WISC with CCTV needed. So lots of you have been doing some adaptations, which we're going to talk about. Awesome. Okay. So if you are unfamiliar with standardized tests, there are great resources in the handout. Like I said, there's a place to access where May and I have put some of our favorites, but right now I'm just going to discuss some specifics about using standardized tests in our population. So who gives these tests? Not all of us in the field are educated on how to give standardized tests, which we've touched on a little bit. Some team members who are include psychs, SLPs, OTs, and PTs, and I'm sure there are some others that I didn't include here, or people who have sought out specific training to give standardized tests. But very few people are actually formally taught how to administer tests to visually impaired students while in school, ourselves included. This is not something most grad programs include. So it's such a niche field and low incidence that all of us need to consult with the experts. Even after attending trainings, you may want to consult for your specific case because each case is so unique. We have to approach these standardized tests with caution and consider the entire student while we're evaluating. And keep in mind that there is a lot more to an evaluation than just the formal standardized scores, as May discussed, but many districts do prefer or say that they require some standardized scores. And to be legally defensible, we need to conduct comprehensive evaluations. So when standardized tests are inappropriate, alternative or informal assessments may provide more meaningful data, and we'll get into that some more. Standardized assessments in all of our fields are very rarely normed on visually impaired population, nor are they normed on students with other disabilities and differences, such as learning disabilities, motor impairments, the deaf and hard of hearing population. Generally, these scores refer to a typically developing population. And so the scores are not only going to be used with caution, but the entire test itself looked at in that lens. Of the few tests that are standardized on this population, many are outdated and impacted by the Flynn effect, which is that the increase in IQ scores over the past century has made a lot of those test norms obsolete. I did see in the chat that there was a test normed on the visually impaired population. I don't know that one myself, but we can look into that as a team. So standardized tests are typically meant to be given as a whole. You are meant to give the whole test and not break it up piece by piece. But many of those subtests are not appropriate for our population, and you will not necessarily be able to give the test in its entirety, which means you will often not be able to calculate what's called index scores. These reflect a student's skills across a few subtests within a general area. And if you cannot give all of the subtests, You cannot calculate an index score. So what do? We adapt using all the knowledge we have of the child and which tests we have access to. Okay, so when administering the test, obviously try to avoid subtests that really rely on visuals. Again, see the handout that Mayana created. You will probably have to give some of your assessment in a non-standardized format. Anything that deviates from exactly how the test manual tells you to administer the test must be reported. Make sure to include it in your report exactly how you change the administration. Consult closely with your TVI, like we've said a million times, if it is appropriate to adapt any of your materials, such as transcribing a Braille, finding out if that child is at the right level for that to be appropriate, if magnification will work using a CCTV. And keep in mind that magnification is not the answer for every student or every test item. Your TVI will let you know what is appropriate for the student, and don't assume you know because you know that student. You may also have to allow for extended time and repetitions, although the test does not allow for it. So especially when giving visuals that have been adapted, the child is not looking at this test the way a typically cited peer would be. So again, make sure you write in your report if you did allow extended time and repetitions. The standard norms will rarely be an accurate reflection of a student's experience. The standard scores, scale scores, percentiles, and age and grade equivalents may hide the student's true skills. And so, as we keep mentioning, we're going to really want to emphasize supplemental ways of observing students, including, as we mentioned, observation and interviews, but also as you're assessing, looking at how the student responds to being frustrated, their task attention, their general approaches to problem solving. And we're also big supporters of including dynamic assessments that May mentioned briefly before, that you can compare baseline skills to their skills after supports have been given and document clearly what supports were given so that you know what was effective. Was it the repetition? Was it auditory presentation or Braille presentation? Was it modeling? How much support did you have to give? Keeping close track of that can really help you. Okay, so as I mentioned, you will more than likely have to adapt some standardized tests to fit your student. You likely won't be able to administer the entire test, but you can create an assessment battery with subtests from multiple tests to get a complete picture. And even with this method, you may not find or have access to an appropriate way to measure a specific skill that you're after. So we are big supporters of including non-standardized formats such as checklists and interviews and all of those things. But if you are accommodating, there are two ways to alter test material. Accommodations, which are changes that do not alter the concepts being tested or the level of difficulty. An example here would be providing Braille, providing large print, magnification. Modification does affect the concepts tested, allowing use of an abacus on a test of mental math as an example. Though the math skills are still being measured, the working memory demands have been reduced. Alternatively, giving a subtest with written items entirely verbally, which takes away the visual requirement, but it increases the working memory demands. All right, so let's move on to the next slide.
Alrighty, so in our handout, I just wanted to point out that in Appendix A, we did an FAQ series for some of our common questions that our assessment center team receives from people throughout the state of California. One of them is for question, I believe number 7 is, what test can I use with a student who's blind or visually impaired? And we had some discussion in the chat about different tools that people are using. And like Rebecca said, when the tests were created, many of the authors of the test intended for the test to be administered in certain batteries within the different subtests, or like in its entirety, depending on the test. But there is a different method of assessment that school psychologists, some like to use, called the cross battery method, or looking at the CHC theory. And this flows along really well with the WJ tests, which are available in large print and Braille. But just so you know, the norms are still on the original kit. The norms were not redone for the Braille or large print versions. And also, if you ordered the kit from APH, for the Braille or large print, you still need the original kit to have all the items that you need for administration. And so when you go to Appendix A, you can go and see different specific areas of the CHC theory where I broke down different tests that are primarily administered auditorily. That being said, it is permissible to provide assessments that have visual stimuli if certain criteria are met. We'll go into that a little bit more, but I also did want to mention one section of the FAQ looks at alternative ways to look at cognition for students maybe who are functioning in the early developmental level. You might want to use the BAME tactile edition to look at skills. It does have a standardized scoring method, but it also can be used as a criterion reference method. That can also be done with the Southern California Oregon Scales of Development, as well as the Oregon project. So I really like the Oregon project because it was developed specifically for students with visual impairments. And it looks at different areas, including cognition, language, compensatory skills, self-help, fine motor, and gross motor skills. Online, you can find a document of one of their previous versions. It's linked in the handout, but there's also print versions of the 6th edition, which is the most current edition at this point in time. You also can look at your ratings from different rating scales like the Evals or DP4 to look at what are reported demonstrations of fluid reasoning or of executive functioning. But again, when we're looking at rating scales, you might need to do an item analysis to see if scores and answers are skewed due to items directly related to vision. And also in this list are tests that are available in large print or Braille, including like some things that were already mentioned in the chat, the BAME, the Brigant, Key Math, the WJ or Woodcock-Johnson 4, and the Wide Range Achievement Test 5th edition. And that's available in UEB and Nemeth. So when we're looking at cross-boundary assessment, one resource that a lot of people like to use is looking at the Essentials series. I love the Essentials series. And there are, again, like I mentioned earlier, there are different methods to look at patterns of strength and weaknesses, and there's different ways that people might attempt to do cross-boundary assessment. And you really should be thoroughly trained before you attempt this method. It's not something that you just hear about like in this quick moment in this evaluation and go and do. You should provide this assessment approach in a structured manner that is consistent between assessments done in your district. So you might want to have a group discussion with your psych department about which method you want to adopt or not. But when we're looking at these multiple different test batteries and pulling different subtests to look at the different narrow band areas of CHA, we can develop a profile that can provide a fuller picture of the student's individual cognitive abilities, and then we can figure out through just one assessment. So what they recommend in their approach is that first you choose one comprehensive intelligence battery, and then you use as many subtests and composites that are valid or applicable. And again, this is about cross-boundary assessment in general, not cross-boundary assessment for visual impairment. So you would not calculate a full scale IQ test, even if you did administer a whole test to a student who has low vision. Even if the student does use vision for learning, there are impacts from their different visual features like acuity and things like that, where it wouldn't be appropriate in most instances to interpret their performance with standard scores. And we'll get into that a little bit later when we talk about reporting scores. But so you start off with your first test kit, and then you pull from other tests, and hopefully from not too many tests, so that you can have a full profile of the different broad CHC areas. And in those broad CSC areas, you want to hit at least 2 of the narrow ability clusters. So I did list it out in the handout. You can click to my separate document that talks about the subtests from different tests that are auditorily administered, but I did copy and paste some of the tables to this main document handout that we provided for this webinar. So to have more confidence when you're drawing inferences about that broad ability, again, a minimum at least 2 qualitatively different indicators for that broad area. And you also want to look at establishing ecological validity for any and all test performance that are suggestive of any sort of normative weakness or challenge. So looking at your records review, interview, and observations, does what the test performance indicate corroborate with these other data that you have collected? And you want to look at how these different challenges manifest in activities of daily living, which includes academic achievement, but can impact other areas as well. And I am looking at my time, and we have about half an hour left, so I'm going to kind of fly through these next slides pretty quickly, since most of the psychologists in the room probably already know the various definitions for the different CHC areas. So fluid reasoning is one area where we're looking at the brain's ability to take in new information without the benefit of practice or experience. It doesn't require background knowledge. So when we're looking at fluid reasoning and we're using this cross-boundary approach, we're looking at assessments that might be part of cognitive and processing achievement, neuropsychological, and even speech language tests. So data from tests like the SELF can also be applied when we're looking at a student's cognitive profile and trying to find meaningful data. So things like the self-semantic relationships also falls under fluid reasoning when we're looking at deductive reasoning or general sequential reasoning. So I broke it down into different parts. So you want to pull subtests from at least 2 areas, but I did add several areas to the handout. Crystallized intelligence looks at your verbal reasoning, a person's general fund of knowledge and vocabulary, and reasoning based on acquired information. And as Rebecca mentioned, visual experiences impact language development, vocabulary development, and the ability to identify something as described. So scores on verbal reasoning may be lower than cited peers due to hollow language or fragmented concept development. For example, on the DOS-2, verbal similarities, that subtest in particular asks how 3 things go together. So consider how a student would contemplate potential categories for items that they haven't been exposed through stories or experience. For example, would a student have meaningful understanding of how hopscotch, checkers, and football go together if they haven't had the opportunity to play or observe such games? And then another example is from the KBC. So I love the DOS and KBC, but they're very visual tests. And so one question from the KBC includes, what has many contests, cowboys, and horses? And that's the part of the KBC second edition normative update riddles subtest. And although a sighted student might not have experienced a rodeo firsthand, they might have casually seen it in a video or looked at images of a rodeo from a story. And that can help solidify their understanding of what activities typically occur and who or what usually is present at a rodeo. If a student with visual impairment hasn't been explicitly taught about cowboys or related concepts about a rodeo, these concepts might be misinterpreted, or they might just make random guesses. Like a cowboy might be guessed to be a young male cow instead of a person who, well, we won't go into all of that, but in an effort to try to get through all of our information, I go to the next slide, is that I hope I am making myself clear that, you know, in terms of our language and concept development, many different parts of our cognition and understanding is impacted by different limitations from our limited access to visual information. So in terms of language development, we're looking at general understanding of language spoken and lexical knowledge. So these are some other areas. Listening ability, general information. Those are some other areas that are narrowed that tie into the larger verbal reasoning broad area. Next broad area we're going to talk about is short-term memory. It's the ability to hold information in immediate awareness, then use it in a few seconds. And so working memory is a part of short-term memory. And when we're looking at scores on short-term auditory memory, these scores might be higher than for our students with visual impairments than for their sighted peers, since students with visual impairments might have to rely on this modality for learning more and have increased practice with the skill. And so here are some subtests looking at memory span. And when we're thinking about working memory is like having a temporary sticky note in the brain. It's a skill that lets us work with information without losing track of what we're doing. And so how a student handles their working memory, which includes recalling and executing multi-step directions, is very important for students with visual impairments. A student who is sighted can access visual supports to assist their recall, but a student with visual impairments might need to rely on their working memory a lot more. And working with students with visual impairments, they might need to be explicitly taught different tips and strategies, such as writing things down or making a note to themselves, using Siri or some other AI from their devices to assist their working memory. Long-term memory. Long-term memory is the storage and retrieval over a long time. It's a very basic definition of that. There's different types of long-term memory, so episodic memory, which is about like important personal events, and semantic memory, which looks at all the facts that you can recall when you're asked. When we're looking at the different narrow areas, there's free recall, looking at the ability to recall lists in any order, meaningful memory. So we're looking at maybe being told a story auditorily and then being asked to recall components of that story. Associative memory, being able to remember previously unrelated information that has been paired. There's also fluency. So for processing speed with our students, if you have maybe magnification or some other large print adaptation for a test, scanning is going to be different when the field of the paper is maybe much larger. And most of our processing speed tests have time components that might be very challenging for our students. And I really would recommend not including processing speed tests when you're like, this goes into not calculating the whole full scale IQ score or overall cognitive score, because it can make an underestimation of the student skill when rather it might be more a reflection of the needs for appropriate accommodations, such as extended time. So Rebecca touched on this a little bit, but we really do want to test the limits with when we're doing standardized assessments. So like many of you already do with other students, you might do a first attempt with standardized procedures, and then maybe allow that time limit to pass. Note where the student finished when that time limit passed, but allow them to continue to see, are they able to accurately answer the question, but they just need a little bit more time? These are the kind of clinical observations that can be really helpful for our evaluations, because what is the purpose of our evaluations? They are to determine how we can best help and support our students. And so ideation fluency is one way you can tap into processing speed a little bit without having that visual motor component involved. So it's where you ask the student to list a large number of objects that fall within a precise category. Auditory processing. So this is what happens when your brain recognizes and interprets sounds around you. There's different components such as phonetic coding and speech sound discrimination. And again, this might be something that you and your speech language pathologist might have many tests that overlap in this area. So you definitely want to collaborate with your teammates to make sure that, you know, if one person is already doing a C-top, do you really need to do the TAPs? Maybe there's a reason to do both if there's maybe your scores look really wonky and are discordant within an index. But again, you want to try to be collaborating with your team members as much as possible so that you're getting meaningful information from the student, as well as hopefully not over testing them and tiring the student out unnecessarily. All right, so we have another question, and are we going to do this question section or are we going to pass through it?
I'm going to jump in. I think let's get through our content, and then at the end, we will try to answer as many of questions as we can. Just so you know, we have colleagues who are copying all of your questions in the chat into a document, so we are looking at those. But let's get through our content before we get stuck on questions.
All right, thank you, Stephanie. So I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca now then.
All right, so we're going to start talking about interpreting the scores that you've just collected in theory from all of these subtests. Something we say a lot on our team is to look beyond the numbers. Compare your scores with information that you have from your informal measures. Do they line up? Is there something glaringly different? I'm going to look at, does my CTOP match with May's? Does one of us have some crazy outliers? And collaborate as much as possible there. And we discussed a little bit before, but using the standardized scores can be really as helpful to track a student's growth over the years. So between their tries, their 3-year evaluations, using those standardized scores to compare a student to their own previous scores. This can be a more appropriate way to use the scores, and they can be great qualitative descriptors more than quantitative. And again, we mentioned in the accommodation section, but document what you changed, what accommodations and modifications you made, not only how you change them, but how that impacts the results, especially with the modifications that are changing the content. And you want to consider how intelligence, the child's development, their unique world experience is going to impact the test. The development, the construction, the administration, interpretation, they're all impacted by the child's vision. Keep in mind that scores on verbal reasoning might be lower than cited peers due to that word hollow language or the fragmented concepts that we talked about. Their lack of world experience and incidental learning impacts many concepts, and especially in language. Collaboration again, SOP, TVI, all of us are working as a unit. And also keep in mind that scores on short-term auditory memory may actually be higher than a cited peer, as students with VI might rely on this modality and have increased practice. But low scores in auditory comprehension are especially concerning, as this is a skill the blind and visually impaired children may need to rely on in the classroom. Back to you, May.
Thanks, Rebecca. And again, I'm going to probably sound a little bit repetitive, but do not calculate and report full scale or overall IQ scores or cognitive scores. And you may, in most cases, you probably will not also report scores for performance or nonverbal or visual index scores as well. There are some cases where you might, but in most cases, you're going to want to use that information qualitatively. So these scores have shown in these areas that have visual stimuli to vary with visual acuity, and particularly on time tests, and especially those where there's bonus points for rapid completion. So you're going to want to interpret the student's performance qualitatively to illustrate the ways in which their performance might deteriorate when there's increased demands placed on their visual system. So, and that is directly from our lovely collaborative assessment book, working with students who are blind or visually impaired. So there's a great chapter in here for specifically for school psychologists. And so also when you're using students' performance on standardized tests as data for determining strategies and accommodations, you really want to focus on what fosters problem solving, learning, and functional skills. So some information from the APH guidance document that we mentioned a few times. And it's in the handout multiple times because we really wanted to make sure you read that APH guidance document. It's a great, straightforward document that I highly recommend any psychologist who's working with a student with visual impairments read the whole thing before you start your assessment. So some information about visual subtests from APH is that visual spatial tests might be helpful, like I mentioned, in determining accommodations and modifications that may be needed for educational or vocational instruction and the materials or revealing strengths for certain types of tests. And when we're interpreting the student's performance, we again want to do it qualitatively, since we don't want to use this information to confirm the presence of other disabilities, since the validity of this information may be greatly impacted. So like I said before, the scores from these visual spatial tests are almost never to be reported. The exceptions are listed in that APH document. There's also great examples in Appendix B of that handout, the APH guidance document, of how you might interpret performance on these visual subtests qualitatively. And also, if you have your wonderful Sattler Bible of assessment, there's also examples for qualitative write-ups for subtests in chapter 20 of the most recent edition, the 6th edition, that is authored by Sattler and Dr. Carol Evans. So I highly recommend you look there too, since most of you probably have that on your bookshelves. And so when you're reporting assessments for individuals with visual impairments, you need to include explanations of the procedures that were followed, any changes in standardized administration, and description of performance observed. And when we're looking at, if you did administer to a student with low vision, any processing speed, if you do calculate the score, again, it might artificially depress. It's not actually reflecting their processing abilities. It might just be an impact of their visual impairment that is slowing them down, and their cognitive tempo might not be as sluggish as it might appear according to the score. And so we want to be really careful about, misusing this data. And I believe someone earlier in the chat mentioned, when we are looking at visual impairment and looking at VI plus or visual impairment with other additional disabilities, you need to recognize that it is important to assess in all areas of suspected disability, but just because your team decides to not recommend qualification under an additional area does not preclude that student from receiving appropriate services where needs have been identified. So even if your team has decided, okay, based on the data we were able to collect meaningfully, this student maybe does not meet criteria for SLD or specific learning disability, that student still has eligibility for special education services. One analogy I hear a lot of times is like, once you have that ticket to Disneyland, once you are eligible for special education services, you're in the door. So you can go on as many rides as you want to. So they are eligible then for any services and supports that are needed to address their identified areas of need. Is it better to assess in all areas to determine that need? Yes. So that's why we do want to assess and look at in the specific list learning disability and autism or intellectual disability. And based on your team, you may or may not decide to recommend it, but you have to document that you are looking at it. And moving on to social, emotional, and behavioral evaluation considerations. These areas actually might be even more important than academic areas, since these non-academic aspects may be more central to the life of the student who's blind and visually impaired to become independent. So assessment of the emotional status of students with visual impairments should be a component of every assessment. Aspects such as self-esteem, or depression and anxiety, they're often part of the clinical picture of a student who has blindness or visual impairment. And we want to identify what's the student's level of awareness of themselves and others, looking at age-appropriate awareness factors. And some students, they can articulate very successfully, very clearly, what supports they need in order to be successful, and others, they need a lot of support of how to find that voice. Projective measures can be, I personally find sentence completion very fun to do, and they can be a great way to tap into this area as well. Self-ratings can be a bit problematic for students who can't see the patterns of others around them. With any rating scale, you need to clarify the impact of capacity or opportunity or support, which others may not have to recognize. And when we're looking at whether the expected behavior for maybe like a adaptive living skill is achievable or meaningful, we need to look, is that behavior, should it be expected of someone who has less visual stimulation? So when we're looking at things like self-restraint and compliance, that may be helpful when a person has desires or goals that would benefit from mastering these skills, but otherwise they could be suppressing energy rather than forward movement. You want to see, why is the student doing these behaviors? And again, our students are at high risk for prompt dependency and learned helplessness. We want to promote their independence and confidence and competency as much as possible. So counseling might be something that you want to look at to determine, would it be appropriate? Is this something that the student might need to have a more integrated sense of self and accept the different assistive technology tools and services and supports that could improve their independence? There are a fair number of teenagers out there who have access to all these wonderful tools, but might not use them because they feel like they don't want to look different from their peers. So in terms of adaptive behavior, you want to collaborate with all your team members since they can bring in different data from what they see with their work with the child, as well as the family, of their daily living skills at home and in community and at school. Our students often have splinter skills, so it might be better to capture daily living skills in checklists and then confirm through interviews and observations. For our younger students, or students who are functioning at an earlier developmental level, some standardized measures might not have enough of a floor or items at the early developmental levels to really show what these students can do. So I really like Michigan's Department of Education Low Incident Outreach's resources. They produce great documents and videos and tools around independent living skills. They have a wonderful checklist that is broken down into different grade levels of what we would expect a student who has visual impairments to do. So at the preschool, second grade, fourth grade, overall elementary school and overall middle school, and 10th and 12th grade guidelines. And then there's one massive document that has all, or not all the items from each of those, but highlighting many of the items from each of those different grade levels. There's also different resources in our handout from some shorter versions from California School of the Blind. And if you are looking to provide intervention around independent daily living skills, I highly recommend explore Michigan's Department of Education Low Incident Outreach's website. They have great modules about it. Okay, so I'm going to switch over to Rebecca.
Great, and we are going to fly through these next few slides because we do want to get to some questions. So report writing, we're talking again about being as collaborative as you can, shifting towards a teacher and parent-friendly report. Some ways to get more collaborative are writing your reports by themes and skill area instead of by test, and making sure you run your recommendations through with your whole team, trying to get an integrated multidisciplinary approach. And as we said before, look beyond the numbers and minimize the emphasis on just reporting your scores, and try and get as much real world information as you can. And yes, that's all I'm going to say about that, so we can move forward.
Okay, I'm going to move on to goals. And again, we're moving kind of quick here. We want to get to questions. Just real quick, the individual needs of each student with visual impairment must guide educational programming, including accommodations, modifications, and instructional strategies. And consider, and it's linked in the handout, there is a document called A Bill of Rights for All Children with Visual Impairments, which was created by the Council of Schools and Services for the Blind and the Association for Education and Rehabilitation of the Blind and Visually Impaired. Take a look at that because it really is a nice perspective. And moving on to the next person, Rebecca.
All right, didn't realize I was back already. So like we said, clearly document your recommendations for eligibility, including eligibility criteria and why students qualify or not under each eligibility category. We have a quote here, an example of that quote. You could say, in the opinion of the school psychologist, the student does meet the eligibility criteria as a student with a visual impairment. All the final decisions regarding eligibility and services will be determined by the IEP team at the IEP meeting. And we've also included in the handout the visual impairment criteria, which you can review. And we want to make sure that you connect the dots. Your meaningful evaluation should lead to an accurate present levels of functioning, leads to appropriate goals and strong services, and the recommendations. Recommendations are often sort of the last piece of the puzzle, the last thing we throw in the IEP, and we want to emphasize that it is really the purpose of your evaluation, that the recommendations are an important part.
And there's no one model that it's not a one size fits all for recommendations. When we're looking at IDEA, we need to ensure that we provide or are offering information about a continuum of placement options for students with disabilities. And if you're in California, remember to always mention that CSB, or California School for the Blind, is on the continuum of placement options when you're looking at FAPE, or free and appropriate public education. And I know a lot of times when teams are looking at least restrictive environment, or LRE, people often think LRE is the setting that's closest to the general education classroom within the home school district or the district of residence. But when we're looking at those considerations, we also need to consider if all aspects of education, is it the least restrictive in terms of academics, physical, health, social, emotional? Is the student able to make connections in the school? And some students, they really might need some additional supports even though they are performing well academically. We really need to look at the behavior and social emotional components too when we're thinking about least restrictive environment. And one quick thing I wanted to add, because we did have a question about IEPs versus 504, if a student is receiving consultation services from a special education service provider, such as a TBI or O&M, to adjust what's happening in the general education classroom to allow the student to receive educational benefit, then those students should continue to qualify under IDEA. And we provided more information in the handout about this, but I want to make sure we get to some of your additional questions. I wanted to let you know that we are starting a listserv. So Dr. Marisa Smith from our psych department at CSB is joining me to co-manage this new listserv, BVIP Psych, and it's meant to be an interactive forum to provide an opportunity for us to continue this discussion and continue sharing ideas and resources with one another and support one another as we strive to strengthen our clinical practices to ensure quality assessments. The link for registration is in our handout, and I'm going to turn it over to Shelby.
There you go. So conclusions. So I really like this quote. You do the best you can with what you know at the time. When you know better, you do better. And this is by Dr. Maya Angelou. So what are we trying to say with this? Up until now, we've all been doing great assessments with the information that we have. And the hope is that now that you have additional resources and information that can help make your evaluations even better. So some main takeaways from today: collaboration is key for a meaningful assessment. You really want to look beyond the numbers for that meaningful data. And I think that concludes our formal information. So now we can get a chance to go to some of those questions. Let's see.
Let's see. I believe, May, we have a couple of questions for you.
Yes, and sorry, I'm going over to the questions document. So, yes, the court is not as concerned if you have the eligibility right. They rather you offer the student appropriate FAPE or free and appropriate education. I do put that in the chat. And so one of the questions is the psychology department in their district refuses to assess any visually impaired students because of the time constraints of standardized tests, even though this person, who I assume might be a vision specialist, offered to be present and prepare materials ahead of time. So due to the low incidence of visual impairment, I feel a lot of psychologists and maybe special education directors might not know what is the appropriate method for assessment. Like we mentioned, you can assess these students, do your very thorough riot and ISIL analysis, and you can do standardized assessments. Well, I shouldn't make a blanket statement like that. Look at your TBI's information about their functional vision and learning media, start there first, and then determine which tests would be appropriate to administer. And then sometimes, if you're lucky and have the bandwidth, your TBI might join you to help you with administering and interpreting the test results. But if you're in California and you have a specific assessment question about a specific case, you can consult with our team and look at, okay, how can we approach this referral question? Are informal measures more appropriate, or can standardized assessment tools be used appropriately? So we've done a lot of the assessment consultations like that. And so, like I said, there's no just one type of student with visual impairment, so it's really hard to say, yes, you should, or no, you shouldn't. It really depends on the student, but it is a possibility. And then let's see, next question. So how do you identify students with intellectual disability or qualify them for modified state assessments? Okay, so if you can't get a full-scale IQ score because there wasn't meaningful engagement with the test, you shouldn't report the score. Like, how meaningful is it? If the student didn't understand what you're asking them to do, this goes also for students without visual impairments. If a student is unable to understand what you are asking them to do or things like that, how meaningful is that information? So you want to make sure that you are trying to find the best ways to see what the student can do independently. I understand some agencies need a score for eligibility to qualify them for things like maybe regional center services and things like that. But if we're talking just about education, you can use things like criterion reference measures, such as the Oregon or the ordinal scales, to look at cognition in an alternative way. And if you see the student is performing skills that are maybe within the developmental range of a student who is maybe younger, like a 5 or 6 year old, when their chronological age is 11, I think you can have enough data from your interviews, observations, rating skills, and these informal direct assessment measures to prove, yes, as a team, we are recommending intellectual disability, or in this case, it probably multiple disabilities because there's already a visual impairment. And then, is there information on how to separate what's VI and what's not? That's a great question. And if we could really answer that, I think we probably wouldn't be here. It's really hard to determine what is the cause of things. And there's quite a bit, so there's a lot of research that is really recent. In 2020, there's a couple articles around autism and visual impairment, or autism, cerebral visual impairment, and intellectual disability. We link those in the chat, and they're great to review the connections between visual impairment and these neurological developmental disabilities. There's a lot of overlap in some of the symptomology we see in terms of social communication behaviors. And can I definitively say that something is from their visual system is causing this behavior? Yeah, I think it'd be really hard to say. Maybe if a student has more intact vision and they are still having certain stereotypical behaviorisms, that might be a clinical clue. Oh, like, there's something else maybe going on. But also, you need to look at the social interactions. Social interactions are so important when we're looking at autism. How are they initiating or engaging? Are they able to sustain meaningful conversations or communication in whatever modality that they use, be it AC or verbally or ASL? And yes, Therese Pollock, sorry if I mess up your last name, Therese, who Carol has dropped in the chat. She is the authority on VI and autism. And so there's a lot of resources out there that your team can look at. There's also this book, Autism Spectrum Disorders and Visual Impairments. There's a lot of checklists in this book. You can see I have a lot of Post-it notes on it. There's a lot of informal checklists that you can use to gather information. So this is a great book if you're looking for some informal measures or certain questions that are important to ask. And let's see.
May,
Go ahead, Steph.
I know we have so many great questions. Unfortunately, we're not going to be able to get to them all. It's 4
I'm over time.
It's 4 o'clock. You have our emails. We do have a copy of these questions, and we'll try to put together a document. We can email everybody with some answers. And you can always get a hold of us. You can email us. We provide a lot of consultation to teams throughout California, and we're happy to talk with you, talk with your teams once we're able to start traveling again due to CDE requirements, California Department of Education requirements. We can come to you for assessments and hopefully resume the style of assessments that we did pre-COVID. And just thank you everybody for attending, and we look forward to feedback, and we hope you're able to use all of the information that we shared.
Yes, thank you.